Hello everyone, this is Fanfic Audiobook. Here you find original fan made audio stories.
Marvel. Start by buying Professor X's telepathic abilities. Part 3. Now that her younger brother was about to recover, there was naturally no need for her to risk her life for the Federation anymore. In truth, once you entered this line of work, wanting to retire unscathed was far from simple. But Shen Mei's status was, after all, extraordinary. The Shen family behind her still possessed considerable strength internationally. In the Federation country, her grandpa had also made many influential friends. Her direct resignation would not cause much of a stir. At the same time Shen Mei was conducting the transaction with Clare, Leon had also finished his call with President Graham. Shu Tingfei's refusal to accept their invitation was something they had not anticipated. But thinking about it calmly, although they held high positions and great power in the Federation country, Shu Tingfei was a god, an existence on a completely different dimension from them. It was perfectly normal for someone like him not to give them face. One could only say that their deep-rooted mindset of being superior had not yet shifted in time. After all, in the past, it was only a matter of whether they wanted to see someone who would dare to refuse their summons. But they quickly adjusted their attitude. After all, Shu Tingfei was unlike any opponent or ally they had ever encountered before. This was a genuine, living deity. The power he displayed, which surpassed the limits of human imagination, and his mysterious nature of appearing out of thin air like a ghost, there was no other more logical explanation besides God. Immediately afterward, President Graham and his party of 4 boarded a private plane to Haverwell. As for why the 4 of them acted together, it was because none of them were willing to stay behind in the White House alone, watching the others seize the initiative. Despite how the 4 of them always appeared as a united front in front of the cameras. In reality, they represented 4 massive forces that both checked and balanced each other while remaining interdependent. Only when facing common interests would they temporarily form an alliance. Once there was no common goal, they were each other's most dangerous competitors. Graham was the current president, so the force behind him was naturally the most powerful. But the consortiums and families behind the other 3 were equally not to be underestimated. On this land, if you wanted to sit in a high position without money or connections, it was a pipe dream. Even if you were a world-famous superstar running for president, if you didn't have a sufficient network of connections, having only money and fame, then you could only be a joker on stage, seeking to please the public with claptrap. The throne of the president would never fall upon your head. So-called democracy has always been a game for the upper-class elites, not a carnival for the common people. No matter how many fans you have, they cannot carry you directly into the White House. As for the strange news that might appear in the future about a comedian becoming president, ordinary people see it as a joke, while those at the top see it as a carefully planned power game. The 4 of them represented the supreme will of their respective interest groups. Since Graham had moved, they naturally couldn't just stand by and watch. Moreover, on the way to Haverwell, they finally understood one thing completely. That was, a brand new, magnificent era was abruptly beginning at an unprecedented speed. And the key to opening this new era was held in Shu Tingfei's hands. All of them had to make changes for this, otherwise, they would only be ruthlessly swallowed by the torrent of the times. History has proven countless times that those stubborn, old-fashioned figures who do not know how to adapt will eventually disappear silently into the dust of time. Wilflame Pharmaceutical Company. Senior researcher Frederick Downing was taking a call with a grim face. What? The plan is cancelled. But we've been preparing for this plan for so long. Fine, I understand. I know what to do. I don't need you fools to tell me. You will definitely regret this. Bang. When the cold dial tone came from the other end of the phone, Frederick slammed the phone in his hand hard against the wall in anger. The phone struck the hard wall, and the screen instantly cracked into a fine spiderweb. Frederick's face was twisted and deformed from extreme anger, looking exceptionally hideous. He was a senior researcher at Wilflame Pharmaceutical Company and also one of the company's shareholders. Although the shares he held were not many. But if Wilflame Pharmaceutical Company could soar to the sky, the value of his shares would definitely rise accordingly, making him an overnight millionaire. The sudden virus outbreak at Haverwell International Airport might be thought of by outsiders as an unfortunate accident. Even if someone guessed it was a deliberate release of the virus, they would never guess that the mastermind behind this was actually them. As for the purpose, it was naturally to take the opportunity to hype it up and sell the virus serum that Wilflame Pharmaceutical Company had long since developed, thus causing the company's stock price to skyrocket in the stock market. And then ruthlessly harvest a wave of leaks. It was hard to say that the shadow of those financial jackals from Wall Street wasn't behind this, because this kind of bloody capital game was exactly the method they liked and excelled at most. But this perfect plan was forced to come to an end before it could truly begin. All because of the appearance of that true god, named Shooting Faye. Their plan had just started when it was directly aborted. Of course, even if the plan failed, the loss was not considered heavy for the wealthy Wilflame Company. But for him personally, the loss was more than just significant. After all, he was the specific implementer of this plan. For this plan, he had been busy for several months, even going so far as to set a trap to harm his colleague, Curtis Miller. He also deliberately allowed Curtis Miller to take the deadly G virus from the company. Now that the plan was forcibly terminated, not only would he not get any of the expected benefits, but if Curtis Miller caused some massive trouble outside, he would definitely be the one to take the fall and suffer. Because the big shots above him had already chosen to abandon him as a pawn without hesitation. When there were profits to be made before, those guys supported him in every way, calling him brother. But now that there was no money to be made, he immediately became trash that could be discarded at any time. No wonder he was so enraged. But this anger could only be a powerless rage. Because he simply couldn't do anything to those high and mighty guys. But he was really unwilling. If the plan had succeeded, his future would have been bright. He would have leapt to become a nouveau riche of high society, achieving a class ascent, and from then on, living a life of luxury and debauchery. Top-tier wines, limited edition luxury cars, beautiful women surrounding him, a luxury villa, never-ending banquets, that would have become his daily routine. But now, everything had vanished into thin air. His future had also turned into pitch-black darkness where nothing could be seen, only an endless abyss quietly waiting for him to jump in. You forced me, since you won't let me have a good life, then no one gets to have a good life. Frederick's face was filled with gloom, and a crazed light flickered in his eyes. Not far away, a large LCD TV was looping a special program about Shooting Faye. Now, Shooting Faye's popularity had reached an unprecedented height. Any superstar or political rising star paled in comparison to him. As long as it was a program related to him, the ratings would definitely not be low. On the internet, various in-depth analysis videos about Shooting Faye's identity were incredibly popular. Any video analyzing Shooting Faye's origins had no less than 10 million views. A true god. Looking at the still photo of Shooting Faye captured by the program on the TV, Frederick revealed a cold and eerie smile. South Africa. Arms giant Glenn Arias had just completed a highly profitable arms deal. Subsequently, he learned the shocking news about Shooting Faye from his subordinates. Because he was in the heart of South Africa where signals were blocked, the time he received the news was already much later than the outside world. A true god. Looking at Shooting Faye in the video, who was displaying divine power like a god descending to earth, a thick look of surprise appeared on Glenn Arias's face. He had completely not expected that such a terrifying existence was still hidden in this world. When he finished watching the entire video without missing a single frame, he frowned slightly and fell into deep thought. A moment later, he took out an encrypted satellite phone and dialed a number. This is Arias. Hand over all subsequent business to Thomas to handle. You, immediately prepare a private jet for me to fly directly to Haverwell. As fast as possible. After saying that, Arias hung up the phone decisively. He was an extremely successful arms dealer with business all over the globe, earning astronomical wealth. As a qualified businessman, he was not only extremely intelligent but also exceptionally good at seizing fleeting opportunities. For instance, at this moment, He had already keenly sensed a brand new, massive business opportunity sufficient to change the world's structure. After Shen Mei left contentedly, the VIP room where Claire was soon welcomed new guests. This time, it wasn't just one or two, but 7 or 8 people came all at once. Their average age was around 70, and each of them exuded the majestic aura of someone who had long held a high position. To these people, Claire was not a stranger. Before becoming a divine envoy, Claire had worked for a charity under the World Health Organization. Her main task was to visit those fabulously wealthy families and tycoons and then persuade them to donate generously to charitable causes. The funds they donated would be used to build hospitals for those poor in backward countries or those ravaged by war. Because in those countries, due to the extreme lack of medical resources, countless people would die in pain every year because they couldn't get timely treatment. After learning of this situation, the World Health Organization immediately launched relevant humanitarian aid plans. That was to build more hospitals for them. But even the World Health Organization did not have enough funds to support such a massive project. Therefore, they needed someone like Claire to persuade those wealthy people to open their vaults. Claire was quite passionate about this job. Although the process was tiring and she often had to endure people's temperaments, she felt that being able to help those truly in need was a very meaningful thing. It was also because of this experience that she was not a stranger to the prominent wealthy people in the Federation country. After all, she held detailed information about them in her hands. Regarding these people, while she might not have a very deep understanding, she could at least accurately call out their names, know their approximate assets, and some of their usual personality traits. And the few who came this time were all well-known top-tier wealthy people in the Federation country. Among them, some were industrial tycoons who controlled the lifeblood of the national economy, while others were financial giants who called the shots on Wall Street. Each person's family background was unfathomable. At the very least, a net worth of tens of billions of US dollars was a certainty. Clearly, these people were the group of big shots who had previously stood behind Davis. As for their purpose for this trip, it was naturally for that miraculous divine medicine that could make one young again and live for another 100 years. When they entered, the massive scale of their arrival naturally also caught the attention of Leon and the others outside. Even if they didn't do the kind of work Claire did, they were likewise not strangers to these top-tier wealthy people who frequently appeared on the covers of financial magazines. A few minutes later, the heavy VIP room door was opened again. Walking out, however, were 8 young people who looked only to be in their early 20s. Each of them was radiant, their faces overflowing with uncontrollable ecstatic smiles. Talking and laughing, they were in high spirits. When they saw Leon and the others guarding the door, they even nodded to them in an extremely good mood before striding away. Leon, Jason, and Patrick were directly stunned, like 3 petrified statues. Because they could be 100% certain that the 8 young people who had just left were the 8 senile wealthy men who had gone in earlier. Because in their current appearance, one could still vaguely see the outlines of their older selves. There was no need to think to know that they must have completed that sensational transaction with Shooting Fei. The 3 of them instantly recalled the information Claire had revealed earlier. The divine medicine that could make one young again and live for another 100 years. But the terrifying price tag of $10 billion per pill left them without even the qualification to dream. They never expected that those old guys were so wealthy and so decisive, directly getting one each without even blinking. From this moment on, they finally completely understood why the president and the others placed such importance on Shooting Fei. After the invitation failed, they didn't hesitate to lower their status and personally rushed over on a private jet at the first opportunity. Judging from the soul-stirring scene just now, encountering an existence like Shooting Fei was already a rare stroke of luck in 3 lifetimes, let alone having any interaction with him. This was a gluttonous feast marking the beginning of a new era. Unfortunately, the admission ticket to this feast was extremely expensive, and very few people were qualified to attend. And they, clearly, were not guests qualified to take a seat. This made the emotions of Leon's trio extremely complex, and for a time, their hearts were filled with unspeakable misery and loss. After all, as long as one is human, they will have their own troubles and regrets. In the past, facing birth, aging, illness, and death, they could only powerlessly accept the arrangements of fate. But now, an opportunity to change their destiny against the heavens was right in front of them. Yet they didn't even have the qualification to touch this opportunity. This feeling naturally made them feel incredibly bitter and aggrieved. After that group of rejuvenated wealthy men left. Soon, the VIP room welcomed new people again. This time, it was some top-tier wealthy people from the local Haverwell city. Leon and the others watched as these people walked in with faces full of anxiety and caution, and then walked out one by one with glowing faces and wide smiles. No need to think to know that regardless of what mood or purpose they had before coming, it could be seen from their expressions when they came out that their wishes had been satisfied. Half an hour later, accompanied by a massive roar, the private planes of the President, Vice President, Minister of Defense, and the President of the Senate finally arrived at Haverwell International Airport. Leon and the other two went to greet them immediately. Afterward, they led these four supreme rulers of the Federation to the outside of the VIP room where Clare was. Soon, the four big shots were respectfully invited into Clare's VIP room. Almost at the same time, heavily armed troops quickly took over the entire airport, and Haverwell International Airport announced it was temporarily closed and no longer open to the public. All civil aviation flights stopped taking off and landing. Of course, those private planes arriving from all over the world upon hearing the news could still choose to land here. President Graham and the other three stayed in Clare's room for nearly 2 hours. When the four of them came out, each of their faces carried undisguised joy and satisfaction. No one knew what kind of secret deal they had reached with Shooting Faye. But it was clear that they were very satisfied with the content of the deal. Subsequently, the company that owned Haverwell International Airport released a shocking piece of news to the outside world. They decided to donate the entire Haverwell International Airport to Mr. Shooting Faye, the god. A piece of bombshell news exploded. Haverwell International Airport was permanently closed to the public from that moment on. A brand new aviation hub had its planning blueprints being drawn up in full swing, with the location selected in an open area not far from the old airport. Time flew by, and as if in the blink of an eye, 3 days slipped away quietly. Shooting Faye, this mysterious Clare, had finalized hundreds of earth-shattering deals. In these short 72 hours, people from every corner of the world, like crucian carp crossing a river, came to meet him, carrying their own desires and ambitions. Their skin colors were different, and their languages were incomprehensible, but the expectation in their eyes was surprisingly consistent. The types of trades were diverse, like an exhibition of human desires. Some humbly begged for cutting-edge technology that could overturn the era. Others, with trembling voices, craved panaceas that could prolong lives flickering like candles in the wind. Even worse, some had blood-red eyes, just to trade for heaven-defying items that could bring the dead back to life. Of course, there was no shortage of madmen eager to obtain absolute power to crush everything. No matter how bizarre or contrary to reason the other party's demands were. As long as they could shell out enough money, Shooting Faye could, like an omnipotent deity, precisely satisfy all their fantasies. However, the threshold to knock on this door of miracles was shockingly high. $100 million was just the minimum consumption. If they couldn't even come up with that little capital, then traveling thousands of miles to get here was just a futile waste of time. It was precisely by relying on this overbearing rule that Shooting Faye's account saw a crazy influx of $12 trillion in just 3 days. This number sounded like a fantasy, exaggerated to the point of making one's scalp tingle. But don't think that these $12 trillion were all his net profit. In reality, the profit that actually fell into Shooting Faye's pocket was only $9 trillion. Only $9 trillion. That's right. The reason the profit was discounted was that a significant portion of the clients purchased cutting-edge technology representing the leap of civilization. This type of knowledge itself was priced outrageously high in the system mall. Of course, Shooting Fei knew clearly that he hadn't lost anything at all. He smacked his lips cunningly, thinking, before delivering each piece of technical data, he would first make a complete backup for himself. This operation was no different from getting future technology for free. Therefore, if the value of these intangible assets was also included, his real income would probably soar to over 11 trillion US dollars. It was simply a massive, blood-pumping profit. This was only 3 days, and he had accumulated enough wealth to buy several small countries. He could foresee that as time fermented, those lucky ones who had tasted the sweetness from him would madly spread his miracles. By then, the people coming to his door would only be as surging and endless as the tide. His wealth empire would continue to expand at an even more terrifying speed. It must be said that this plan was perfect and successful beyond measure. System, Shooting Fei whispered in his mind, upgrade the dimensional teleportation skill for me. Upgrading the dimensional teleportation skill requires deducting 200 billion US dollars. Do you confirm? The cold mechanical voice rang out immediately. Confirm. A hint of an imperceptible smile hooked the corner of Shooting Fei's mouth. Now that his account held over 10 trillion in cash flow, a mere 200 billion expenditure didn't even make him blink. Myriad Heavens Mall System. Host, Shooting Fei. Age, 22. Race, human. Lifespan, immortal. Money, 13.64 trillion US dollars. Items, Gothic Dark Potion, Invisibility Mirror. Abilities, Dimensional Teleportation, cooldown 3 hours, can be reduced with money, super self-healing and regeneration, Cold Weapon Mastery, Thermal Weapon Mastery, High-Speed Movement, Quicksilver Version, Hulk Transformation, Perfect Version, Telepathy, Magnetic Control, 12 Talismans, Demon Power. The skill panel refreshed, and the original 3-day cooldown was abruptly shortened to 3 hours. 3 hours, neither long nor short. Shooting Fei didn't plan to continue throwing money at this skill for now. After all, every time he traveled to a new world, he had to spend some time planning and experiencing it. A 3-hour cooldown was already more than enough. Any shorter, and there was no need for it for the time being. Looking at the 13.64 trillion US dollars remaining in his account, Shooting Fei felt the urge to spend surging in his heart again. He remembered that when he was still an ordinary person, watching the DC movie, Man of Steel, he had fantasized countless times. If one day he could be like Superman Clark, basking in the sun to become infinitely stronger, how cool would that be? And now, this once unattainable daydream was about to become reality. Many people complained that Clark in Man of Steel performed too poorly and didn't live up to the world-destroying settings in the comics. But in Shooting Fei's view, the movie version of Superman was already outrageously strong. Perhaps he was a bit raw in the early stages. But by Justice League, he returned from death, wearing a suit as black as night, and that suffocating pressure still remained fresh in his memory. In Superman's settings, every death and rebirth made him even stronger. Moreover, Superman's growth curve was extremely long. This was also one of the reasons why Superman's performance in the movie was unsatisfactory. But could he use some way to crazily accelerate his growth? Then, the height he could reach would be enough to make all civilizations in the universe tremble. The most perverted thing about Superman was his dazzling combination of superpowers and his almost endless growth limit. These were his most terrifying assets. Therefore, in the System Mall, the price of Superman Serum movie version was as high as 3 trillion US dollars. As for the Silver Superman Serum, from the comics, the marked price reached a terrifying 3 trillion US dollars. Converting it, that was 3,000 trillion. This astronomical figure made even Shooting Fei feel a bit dizzy. He didn't know how many worlds' wealth he would have to scrape together to gather it. However, he thought again, with the system in hand, he didn't seem to need to buy that Silver Superman Serum. Because he could completely rely on himself to step by step grow into a Silver Superman. The method was very simple: throw himself into the sun and take a 100,000-year energy bath. And Shooting Fei happened to have a way to extremely compress this process. Perhaps it wouldn't take 100,000 years. In just a few years, he could transform into that legendary existence. But before that, he had to take the first step. System, buy me a Superman serum. Purchased item, Superman serum. Deducted 3 trillion US dollars. The moment the words fell, a vial flickering with a dark blue luster appeared out of thin air in Shooting Faye's hand, and a cold sensation came from his palm. He didn't even bother to find a syringe. Unscrewing the cap, Shooting Faye tilted his head and drank the viscous blue liquid in one gulp. The next second, he felt all the blood in his body ignite and boil instantly. A violent and peerless force rampaged through his body, as if trying to tear apart and reorganize every one of his cells. Fortunately, he had the protection of the 12 talismans, power at this moment, otherwise, this first wave of impact alone would have been enough to make him explode and die. The overbearing nature of the Superman serum was far superior to the previous Hulk serum. Its transformation of Shooting Faye's body was also more profound and perverted. As for whether his body would collapse with so many messy abilities gathered in one, that was simply not in Shooting Faye's consideration. What the system produces must be a boutique. This is an iron rule, and there is absolutely no possibility of any mistakes. This rebirth-like transformation lasted for more than half an hour. When all the storms subsided, Shooting Faye slowly stood up, and he was surprised to find that his height had actually broken through 2 meters, like a small giant. He frowned slightly, and with a thought, the power of the monkey talisman was activated, and his figure immediately returned to his previous height. But his entire outline was a size larger than before, appearing even more burly and sturdy. If he took off his shirt, his bulging back muscles would definitely be a demon back, with ferocious lines. At the same time, a brand new world opened its doors to him. He found that he could actually see the energy everywhere, and the whole world instantly changed its appearance in his eyes. That feeling was mysterious, as if he had opened the legendary heavenly eye. Fortunately, this visual mode could be turned on or off at will. Under the gaze of his heavenly eye, he could clearly see countless colorful energy particles, like iron filings attracted by a magnet, scrambling to converge toward him, and then being greedily absorbed by his body. Many people mistakenly thought that Superman could only become stronger by absorbing sunlight. But in reality, his setting was that he could absorb any form of energy in the universe to strengthen himself. It was only because absorbing sunlight was the most efficient and convenient that this stereotype was created. In fact, he was a walking perpetual motion machine of energy. This also explained why in Justice League, Batman and the others could resurrect him with the energy of the Mother Box. The next moment, Shooting Faye's figure disappeared into thin air in the hotel room. He had already appeared above the clouds at an altitude of 10,000 meters. The bright sunlight poured onto him without reservation, warm and scorching. Shooting Faye could clearly feel that every cell in his body was cheering and jumping, as if they had independent consciousness, ecstatic for this energy feast. This was certainly not an illusion. But because the massive energy contained in the sunlight was being crazily devoured by his cells, strengthening and transforming his life essence at an unprecedented speed. Shooting Faye did not stop and continued to accelerate upward. Soon, he broke through the thin atmosphere and was directly exposed to the cold and dead vacuum of the universe. With the blessing of the talisman's power, weightlessness and lack of oxygen had no effect on him. After arriving in outer space, the solar radiation and cosmic energy he could absorb were purer and more majestic. The yin-yang balance power of the Tiger Talisman allowed him to clearly perceive that he was getting stronger every moment at an incredible speed. Only a few minutes passed. Shooting Faye had successively awakened several of Superman's iconic abilities. Steel body, super strength, super speed, super endurance, super vision, super hearing. As time passed and energy was continuously poured in. Super brain, bio force field, heat vision, X-ray vision, were also lit up one after another. In less than a day, Shooting Faye had already completed the path that Clark had stumbled through for more than 20 years. Moreover, his power was still soaring at an exponential rate. Because from now on, his body would be automatically absorbing surrounding energy to strengthen himself at every moment. His growth rate was destined to far outstrip Clark's. Don't forget, there were other equally terrifying powers sleeping in his body. Hulk, Professor X's telepathy, Magneto's magnetic control, the 12 talismans, demon power, Quicksilver's super light speed movement. Any one of these abilities would be enough to make a person stand at the pinnacle of the world. And shooting phase strengthening was a superposition and sublimation based on all these top-tier abilities. Compared to that kind-hearted Kansas farm boy, he would be even more terrifying. This was the first time in shooting phase life that he truly felt what omnipotent power was. That feeling was as if the entire universe was crawling at his feet, letting him gallop wantonly. A nearly arrogant thought crazily sprouted in his heart: he was already invincible. If it were before redeeming that Superman serum, facing Thanos holding 5 Infinity Stones, Shooting Fei would have still been nervous, not having full confidence in being able to pin the opponent to the ground and rub them. But now, at this moment, he was full of absolute self-confidence, a kind of self-confidence that was overflowing to the point of spilling out. Let alone Thanos only having 5 Infinity Stones, even if he held all 6, Shooting Fei felt he could steadily suppress him. Thanos with 5 stones and him with 6 were completely different dimensions of existence. The former was at best a top overlord in a single universe. And the latter, mastering 6 stones, was an existence that could be respected as a multiverse-level powerhouse. The gap between the two was even greater than a chasm. If Shooting Fei were to face that complete form Thanos with 6 stones now, it would be hard to say who would win or lose. After all, in Marvel's settings, gathering all 6 stones was equivalent to speaking the law, making wishes come true. However, if the opponent was only that Thanos holding 5 stones, Shooting Fei hooked his mouth into a cold sneer. He had 100% confidence that he could completely crush the opponent. And it wasn't just as simple as crushing. He could easily deprive him of his life while ravaging him. After all, that dramatic scene in the movie was still vivid in his mind. Thunder God Thor, if his axe hadn't been crooked, slashing at Thanos' chest instead of his head, that universe overlord who gathered 6 stones might have received his lunchbox on the spot. This might have included some elements of Thanos being careless. But the fact was that even Thunder God Thor almost created a miracle and killed Thanos in his prime. Then, how could he, Shooting Fei, whose power had already far exceeded Thunder God Thor, not have the confidence to end a Thanos with only 5 stones? How strong was his power now? Even if Thor, who had awakened the power of Thunder God after the later fall of Odin, stood in front of him, he would only be unilaterally beaten. Even if Shooting Fei had the heart to kill and wanted to take Thor's life, he wouldn't need to spend much effort at all. For him, that would be a trivial matter he could handle with ease. Perhaps it was because he had never possessed such world-destroying power before. For the first time, Shooting Fei realized that sunlight shining on his body could bring such extreme comfort. The energy contained in the sunlight, like the gentlest warm current, seeped into every cell of his body, making every pore groan with delight. He was even somewhat intoxicated by this wonderful sensory feast, unable to extricate himself. This sunbathing session had quietly passed for 3 whole days. And in the 3 days he was away, Earth had turned into a complete mess. After all, there was still a huge crowd of people eagerly lining up, waiting to trade with Shooting Fei. As a result, the main person had vanished into thin air. Even Clare, who acted as his spokesperson, could not contact him at all. Those who had already gotten ahead and completed trades with Shooting Fei, while still craving another opportunity, were much calmer in their mindset compared to those who hadn't entered the game yet. They secretly rejoiced, fortunate that they had acted quickly, at least having boarded the train once. As for those who hadn't managed to connect with Shooting Fei yet, they were like ants on a hot pan, rushing around in anxiety. Before, it was because they received the news too late and missed the first wave. Later, after finally finding out that the trade required real money, they rushed to raise funds, fearing their own assets wouldn't be enough to buy what they wanted. But now, the money was finally ready. Shooting Fei, however, was nowhere to be found. Claire was also helpless, she had no way to initiate contact with Shooting Fei. Because every time, it was he who would elusively initiate contact with her. Perhaps it was because of the fusion with the Superman serum. After greedily absorbing sunlight and cosmic thermal radiation for 3 full days, Shooting Fae's telepathy ability received an explosive enhancement. Now, he didn't even need to deliberately activate the ability to faintly capture the thought fragments of countless surrounding life forms. What they were thinking in their hearts, those fragmented thoughts, like weak electrical signals, were automatically transmitted into his mind. If it could be said that the previous Shooting Fae's telepathy could cover at most half of Earth, then now, as long as he wished, with a single thought, the inner voices of everyone on the entire Earth would have nowhere to hide before him. Combined with his brain that rivaled a supercomputer, he could easily browse anyone's memories and discern their deepest secrets. He could even destroy hundreds of millions of consciousnesses in an instant, turning them into mindless living dead. It is no exaggeration to say that in the field of telepathy, Shooting Fae had completely surpassed Professor X. Even if Professor X were given a cerebro, he could not be compared to the current Shooting Fae. Because, Professor X did not have a super brain, let alone the magical power of the 12 talismans. Whether in terms of mental energy recovery speed or strength, he and Shooting Fae were simply not on the same dimension. Has it already been 3 days? When countless noisy thoughts from the entire Earth flooded into his mind like a tide, Shooting Fae suddenly realized. So, from the time he left Earth and came to this dead, silent vacuum of the universe, 3 full days had passed. Placed within this eternal darkness and solitude, time seemed to have lost its meaning. He was completely immersed in the pleasure of sunbathing, not realizing the alternation of day and night at all. That feeling was too wonderful. It was just like getting a long-desired toy when he was a child, unwilling to let go for even a second, insisting on playing until he was satisfied and bored. Shooting Fae felt exactly like that at this moment. But he knew in his heart that it was time to go back. His business still needed to continue. It was merely 12 trillion US dollars. For the massive economic systems of the various nations on Earth, what did this amount of money count for? He wanted to earn more money, enough to buy the entire world. Relying on the unfathomable power of the 12 talismans, Shooting Fae instantly locked onto Clare's coordinates on Earth. Subsequently, he turned into a stream of light and flew rapidly in that direction. The destination was still Haverwell International Airport. This place had now truly become Shooting Fae's exclusive territory. Because his trades with everyone were all completed here through Clare. Although the airport had long stopped being open to the public, it was still crowded with people from all over the world. The scene was exceptionally lively, even somewhat noisy. Long warning lines were set up around the perimeter of the airport, with heavily armed military and police nervously maintaining order. Even though Shooting Fae had disappeared for 3 days, the crowd here had not dispersed, but instead gathered more and more. Because no one knew when that my lord would suddenly descend. Those who were desperate to trade simply set up camp right inside the airport. Because there were too many people, the space was simply not enough. Some people simply brought a quilt, found a corner to sleep on the ground, and had dedicated personnel responsible for delivering their daily food and drink. The scene felt just like a superstar was about to hold a concert, and crazy fans were camping out overnight in line to snap up tickets. Inside the airport's VIP lounge. Compared to before, it had become even more luxurious. The room had been furnished with many brand new, high-end pieces of furniture, and the air was filled with a faint scent of aromatherapy. Clare was currently living here. Her friend and niece had already been properly sent away by her. Now, this spacious VIP room was occupied by her alone. Of course, besides her, there was one man in the room. A man who was 1.9 meters tall, with an exceptionally burly and strong build. The man looked to be about 30 years old. He had short, neat hair, sharp eyes, and looked energetic, full of a soldier's masculine aura. Judging by his appearance, he looked about 30% similar to Clare. Because this man was none other than Clare's older brother, Chris Redfield. Chris was originally in South Africa executing a secret mission. Who knew that halfway through the mission, his superior suddenly ordered him to abort the mission immediately and return at once. Although Chris was full of helplessness, he could only obey the order and give up the task that was about to be completed. Because he had been in a mission state and isolated from the outside world, he had no idea that earth-shaking changes had already taken place outside. He didn't even know that his own younger sister had transformed and become the legendary, God's emissary. After all, this era had not yet entered the self-media age of information explosion. Online videos were far less popular than in later generations, and people's channels for obtaining information were relatively limited. Moreover, the overwhelming reports on television were all about Shooting Fei himself. Although there was also news about Clare, the quantity was not large, and most of the time it was just glossed over. Therefore, Chris had absolutely no idea that his own sister had become the God's emissary in the spotlight. It wasn't until he returned to the base that his immediate superior personally talked to him and made him watch the news footage repeatedly several times. Only then did he confirm with disbelief that the super lucky person who was chosen by Shooting Fei to become the God's emissary was indeed his own younger sister, Clare. In a sense, his sister had transformed from an ordinary person into an entity close to a god. Even if just a God's emissary, relying on the power bestowed upon her by Shooting Fei, she was enough to be called a god. However, compared to a true god like Shooting Fei, she still appeared very weak. Subsequently, the news came that Shooting Fei had suddenly disappeared, and even Clare could not contact him. Immediately after, he received a brand new mission. A mission that sounded somewhat absurd: come to Clare's location, wait for the rabbit, and wait for news. Whenever Shooting Fei appeared again, he had to contact them at the first opportunity. This was his new mission. Although it sounded like nonsense, as a soldier, Chris had no right to refuse, unless he chose to retire right now. Moreover, to be honest, he really hadn't seen Clare for almost a year. The siblings had always been very close. Every time a mission ended, he would call his sister immediately to report that he was safe. Even if he didn't call, Clare would initiate the call. But the voice on the phone could never compare to a living person standing in front of you. The last time the siblings met was nearly a year ago. After all, the nature of both their jobs involved running all over the world. Wanting to meet up was really not an easy thing. Therefore, regarding this mission, Chris's heart was actually not resistant. It's truly ironic when you think about it. In the past, he risked his life executing those dangerous missions where death was always near, yet he never saw his rank on his shoulders move at all. Now, it was just coming to Clare's place for a vacation. Not only was it recorded as a great achievement, but before the mission had even started, his rank had already been promoted against the rules. Even the allowance had directly skyrocketed 20 times compared to before. There were also various types of subsidies. Before he even arrived, $1 million had already been transferred to his account. He also didn't know how the fact that he was Clare's brother had leaked out. Within just an hour, his private phone had been blown up. The purpose of everyone calling was much the same, all beating around the bush to express that when Shooting Fei returned, they hoped to be notified at the first opportunity. He hadn't done anything yet. He had only just stepped onto the plane flying to Haverwell. The balance in his bank card had already increased by tens of millions of US dollars. This was an astronomical figure that he could absolutely never earn in his entire life as a soldier. To say he didn't like money would be a lie. In this world, how many people could truly be indifferent to money? After all, with money, at least one wouldn't need to worry about material life. Moreover, he wasn't young anymore, and it was time to consider finding a girlfriend and getting married. Being single until now wasn't because he didn't want to find someone, but because his meager savings gave him no confidence to do so. Chris's parents passed away very early. In the year he was 20 and his sister Clare was only 12, their parents both passed away in a sudden traffic accident. From that day on, Chris had to immaturely shoulder the heavy burden of the family and take care of his young sister. The money for Clare's university education was all saved bit by Chris using the allowances he earned as a soldier. Even so, it still wasn't enough. Chris even took out a large loan from the bank because of this to make up for Clare's expensive tuition. In the United States, wanting to attend a good university, the tuition is not a small sum. Many students from poor families would choose student loans, so much so that many people were already burdened with heavy debts before they even walked out of the school gate. The reason Chris later transferred to BSAA was because although this anti-bioterrorism organization was more dangerous, the subsidies and salary were also higher. In the Navy SEALs, the reward for a mission was about $10,000 or so. For missions with a higher danger level, it could be several tens of thousands. But the usual daily salary was only a few hundred. And in BSAA, the salary for a single mission started at $30,000. Because they were facing biochemical viruses and mutated monsters, the danger coefficient was far higher than regular missions. Therefore, the salary was also exceptionally generous. At the most, a single mission could even fetch over $100,000. Was Chris short of money? Of course he was. If he wasn't short of money, he wouldn't risk his life to join BSAA. As for generating electricity for some noble ideal, stop joking, he wasn't that selfless yet. He had served in BSAA for almost 2 years. And he had indeed saved up some money. But the most ridiculous thing was that all the savings he had exchanged his life for over these 2 years combined didn't even amount to 1/10 of the spare change in his bank account when he boarded the plane after answering a few hours of phone calls. When on the plane, Chris was still constantly sighing that this world was truly too magical. And for the arrival of her brother Chris, Claire had long been mentally prepared. After all, her identity was no longer a secret. She was also not an orphan without any relatives. In this world, the person closest to her was her own older brother, Chris. The bond between the siblings was genuinely very good. The reason Claire became one of the survivors of the Raccoon City incident was because she couldn't contact Chris at the time, and later learned that her brother had gone to Raccoon City to execute a mission. Worried about her brother's safety, she resolutely asked for leave from school and went alone to that city, which later turned into hell. It was also in Raccoon City that she met Leon. The siblings reunited after a long time and didn't say anything sensational. They just sat together, chatting about some trivial matters in life and sharing their respective experiences. Chris very tacitly did not ask about anything related to shooting Faye. But Claire knew in her heart that her brother coming over this time was for shooting Faye. "I'm back. I'll handle today's trade personally. I'll give you a break. You can take your brother to Haverwell City for a good stroll." Just at this moment, Shooting Faye's familiar and slightly majestic voice rang out in Claire's mind without warning. A smile of surprise instantly bloomed on Claire's face, with unconcealable joy in the corners of her eyes and brows. The momentary change in expression on his sister's face was captured by the sharp-eyed Chris. "Is that person back?" Chris lowered his voice and asked tentatively. That person he referred to, naturally, was Shooting Faye. "Yes." Claire nodded vigorously. Without saying another word, Chris immediately took out his phone and started making a call. After all, this was his primary mission for coming here this time. The money had been received, and now the main person had appeared. If he didn't pass the news on at the first opportunity, that would be his dereliction of duty. Outside the airport. Boom. Accompanied by a huge sonic boom, Shooting Faye descended from the sky with a standard superhero landing steadily in the center of the airport runway. Even though this was an airport runway, it was densely packed with people at this moment. "Oh God. It's a god. My lord has appeared. Is this the legendary Jade Emperor? So handsome. As expected, he is a Daxia person. But, why would the Jade Emperor appear in the Federation country instead of in Daxia?" A young man who was clearly of Daxia descent muttered excitedly to himself. Seeing Shooting Faye's appearance, the entire airport instantly boiled over, like a pot of boiling water. Most people's eyes revealed an almost fanatical worship. Quite a few people were even so emotionally stirred that they knelt down in the direction of Shooting Faye on the spot, prostrating themselves. When Shooting Faye landed just now, that ear-piercing sonic boom was clearly audible. After landing, although the ground beneath his feet remained intact, the moment his feet touched the ground, everyone present clearly felt the earth beneath them shake violently. Shooting Faye swept his gaze indifferently, taking in the thousands of people at the scene. White people, black people, Asian people, Arabs, Indians. It almost encompassed all races and countries in the world. But without exception, their faces all wore the same fervent and expectant expressions. Today's transactions will be conducted by me personally. In your minds, state what you want. If I have it here, I will inform you of the price required. Shooting Fei's voice was not loud, yet it rang clearly in everyone's ears, as if he were whispering right in front of you. The old Shooting Fei could not have pulled off such a high-end operation. But after purchasing the Superman serum and possessing a super brain, his processing speed far exceeded any computer. He could process hundreds of millions, or even billions, of information streams in an instant. How many people were here right now? At most, only a few 100,000. This amount of information was not even worth mentioning to the current Shooting Fei. And Shooting Fei's words made everyone present ecstatic. Because previously, to trade with Shooting Fei, there was a hard threshold: you had to have assets of over 100 million US dollars. With less than that amount, you couldn't even see Clare, let alone trade. But things were different now. With Shooting Fei coming forward personally, all those harsh thresholds were cancelled. People excitedly closed their eyes and began to silently recite their wishes in their hearts. Because this was Shooting Fei's requirement. He would know what they were thinking. And this move further solidified Shooting Fei's identity as a deity. If he were not a god, how could he possibly discern what everyone was thinking? Almost everyone was already deeply convinced of Shooting Fei's identity as a deity. The current transaction process had also become simpler and faster than before. Shooting Fei no longer needed people to transfer money to a system-designated account to complete the collection. Instead, as long as the other party agreed to the transaction, he could directly deduct the corresponding amount from their bank account through the system, or directly take the valuables they had stored somewhere. This was a new feature unlocked after the System Mall upgrade. To upgrade this feature, Shooting Fei spent a full 100 billion US dollars. However, this feature was worth more than its price to him. It greatly accelerated the efficiency and volume of transactions. It also better matched his current style as a deity. The content of ordinary transactions varied, with most people purchasing drugs to treat stubborn ailments. Many people had been sentenced to death at major hospitals before running here to try their luck. The vast majority of them were suffering from terminal illnesses. There were also a small number of people who came to purchase various high-tech technologies. These people were either representatives of some official agency or representatives of large multinational corporations. Those coming to purchase supernatural powers were, in fact, the fewest. However, even so, Shooting Fei's Super Soldier Serum still sold quite well. After the transaction was completed, those who had completed their transactions would be sent directly home by Shooting Fei using a magic gate that appeared out of thin air. He even saved them the travel expenses. In this way, those still waiting in line outside the airport could immediately come in and continue to trade with Shooting Fei. As for this cool magic gate trick, it was naturally a skill Shooting Fei purchased from the System Mall. This skill was not expensive, just a few 100 million US dollars, which was dirt cheap for the current Shooting Fei. Of course, it was also very practical. Just like that, after trading with one batch and sending them away, a new batch would immediately flood in. In just one day, the volume of transactions Shooting Fei completed reached an astonishing number, tens of millions. Of course, this also earned Shooting Fei a fortune even larger than before. Although in this round of transactions, the profit of most orders was very low, with a single order being only tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of US dollars. But the quantity was massive. Little by little, it gathered into a sea. Moreover, there were also quite a few super large orders in the 100 billion US dollars range. These large orders basically came from various national governments. As for those orders in the tens of billions, they were scraped together by some poorer countries, exhausting their national strength. What they purchased was mostly critical technology. For them, if they wanted to develop their country and make their people prosperous, they had to master core high-end technology. But because the country was poor and lacked professional technical talent, In terms of technology, they were always in a position of being backward and vulnerable, and wanting to catch up was an almost impossible task. And if they wanted to directly purchase technology from other developed countries, they simply wouldn't sell it. No matter how much money you offered, they wouldn't sell it to you. It was a blatant technological blockade against you. You could have the finished product, but if you wanted to learn the technology, there was no chance. But at Shooting Faye's place, there were none of those messy restrictions. Whatever technology you wanted, he could sell it to you. Of course, the premise was that you had to be able to afford the price. Otherwise, even if you wanted to buy, Shooting Faye couldn't do anything. He was a businessman, not a philanthropist. However, for those who truly had no money but sincerely wanted his help, Shooting Faye would consider it at his discretion. If the other party was a kind-hearted good person, he didn't mind lending a hand. After all, Shooting Faye possessed the ability of telepathy, and no one could hide their secrets in front of him. As for those selfish guys who still wanted to take advantage of him, sorry, there was nothing he could do. But even so, within a day, the transaction volume of tens of millions of orders also allowed Shooting Faye to earn more money in just 24 hours than the previous 3 days combined. The net profit directly soared to 25 trillion US dollars. While Shooting Faye was conducting massive transactions in full swing, there were also people in the shadows, starting to stir and preparing to make trouble. Inside the underground secret laboratory of Wilflame Company, Frederick Downing carefully extracted a tube of purple liquid emitting an ominous aura from the centrifuge. This was what he had spent several whole days, without sleep or rest, to create, an enhanced version of the G-virus. Its characteristics were higher infectivity and stronger mutation ability. Compared to the ordinary G-virus, the monsters it created would be even harder to kill. Although the original plan had been cancelled by those fools. But now, those guys were busy trading with Shooting Faye, scrambling to buy youth and longevity, and had no time to pay attention to him, a small character who had been kicked to the curb. I heard that counselor, Davis, had also been ruthlessly abandoned by them. He had originally wanted to win over Davis and retaliate together against those guys who burned bridges after crossing them. But unfortunately, Davis was a spineless coward who had neither the guts nor the courage, and he didn't dare to cooperate with him at all. That guy Davis was, at least, a counselor. The power in his hands was actually not small. If he were willing to cooperate, the success rate of his plan would definitely increase significantly. It was a pity that coward, Davis, had refused him. In Davis's words, even if those people kicked him aside, making him feel incredibly angry. But in order to keep his status and position as a counselor, even if he was angry, he could not show any dissatisfaction. At least, he still had the title of counselor now. Everywhere he went, he could get respect from others. Those ordinary people dared not offend him at all. Why would he risk losing everything to cooperate with him? However, all this didn't matter anymore. He had already researched the new type of G-virus. If Davis wasn't willing to cooperate, there were naturally people who were. Curtis, look at this, the latest type of G-virus. Its transmissibility is stronger, and its mutation ability is even more terrifying. At the critical moment, inject it into your body, and believe me, you will gain the powerful strength you used to dream of. You actually really managed to create this thing. Curtis held that tube of virus sample emitting a dangerous light, his voice trembling slightly. Although he was just an ordinary researcher at Wilflame Company, he was also very clear about how difficult the research on the G-virus was. Previous research had completely fallen into a bottleneck, and wanting to improve any data of the virus was already a task as difficult as ascending to heaven. But he didn't expect that Frederick Downing, the former project supervisor, had actually done it. Little did he know that Frederick had long been pushed into a dead end. At least in Frederick's own view, the termination of the plan was equivalent to the arrival of doomsday for him. Because all his good life and all his aspirations for the future turned into bubbles in that instant. Under these circumstances, all that remained in his heart was a burning heart of revenge. In a state of desperate madness, his potential was instead completely forced out. Therefore, he was able to successfully develop this more powerful, or rather, more terrifying G-virus within just a few days. Correct. Frederick wore an incredibly haggard face, yet his eyes flashed with pathological excitement. To develop this new type of virus, he had been working overtime until dawn almost every day these past few days, treating the laboratory as his home. If it weren't for that heart of revenge constantly stimulating him, he would never have been able to persevere. Don't forget what I told you before about how your family died. It was because of those greedy guys at the company. How many people did those fools kill for the sake of profit? Among them, surely you had a part in it too, didn't you? Curtis asked coldly in return. I admit that I had a part in it. But you also know that, just like you, I am only a researcher. I have absolutely no authority to veto the orders of the higher-ups. Frederick leaned closer to Curtis, his voice filled with seductiveness. Think about it carefully. Your loved ones are all gone now, while the murderers who killed them have not only regained their youth because of that God who suddenly appeared, but they can also live happily for another 100 years. They live the good life every day that you wouldn't even dare to imagine, with fine wine in hand and beautiful women in their arms. And what about you? You can only live alone, in pain and regret. Are you really willing to accept this? Don't you want to do something about it? Curtis knew that Frederick was deliberately stoking the flames, provoking the deepest hatred in his heart. But he had to admit that every word the other party said was like a sharp knife, stabbing fiercely into his heart. Those guys ruined his family, so why did they get to live a good life? Why did they get to live for another 100 years? This is too unfair. Thinking about such things alone makes one burn with rage, wishing to tear them into 10,000 pieces. Seeing the twisted expression on Curtis's face, Frederick showed a satisfied smile. This is the simplest method of inciting conflict, but it is often the most effective. At least, his goal was easily achieved. According to our previous plan, you are responsible for finding those guys and releasing the virus when they are at their most triumphant. And what about you? Curtis asked vigilantly. Me. Of course, I have other tasks to complete. Frederick smiled and patted Curtis on the shoulder, appearing sincere and confidential. Although I admit that I did think about screwing you over before, now we have a common enemy. Rest assured, this time, we are comrades in arms in the same camp. Curtis knew clearly in his heart that this guy Frederick definitely had bad intentions and might be harboring some other devious plans. But it didn't matter anymore. Having lost all his family, he had long since lost the desire to continue living. His only thought now was to take revenge on those who had caused his current miserable state. For this, he didn't mind being a chess piece for Frederick once. Because with this guy's help, the success rate would be much higher than if he acted alone. Furthermore, they now had this even more powerful G-virus in their hands. Once this thing is released, it will be the true ultimate weapon. Regardless of what your goal is, this time, I don't mind being your chess piece. Curtis's voice was cold and resolute. Frederick was very satisfied with Curtis's answer. This was the attitude he wanted. This was also the reason why he chose Curtis as a partner. Although this guy's ability was average, his determination for revenge was big enough and crazy enough. Facing those top billionaires standing at the pinnacle of the world, ordinary people really didn't have the guts to provoke them. After all, the success rate was extremely low, and once failed, liquidation was the inevitable outcome, and even family members would suffer along with them. But Curtis was different. He no longer had any family, so he didn't need to worry about being retaliated against by those guys after failure. Because his family had long since died because of those guys. As for the fact that he still had a younger sister, Curtis wasn't too worried. After all, his sister was a captain of the SWAT team. To be able to reach the position of captain in the SWAT team, it was clear that his sister was definitely not simple. In Curtis's view, his sister, Angela Miller, was much more capable than he, her older brother. The matter hadn't even taken shape yet, and he was already thinking about an escape route in case of failure. Wasn't that complete nonsense? Being timid and hesitant, that kind of mindset couldn't make it on the battlefield. Moreover, if he and Frederick won the gamble, those old guys wouldn't even be able to get a single hair of revenge. Very good. Curtis's voice was low and powerful. Then I wish us a happy cooperation. Frederick handed over a black square object. It was the kind of satellite phone that could maintain communication even in the wilderness. Take this, I will keep in touch with you at any time and give you the latest intelligence. Those fools are all holed up in Haverwell City now. Frederick lowered his voice, his eyes flashing with a near fanatical light. I heard that the mysterious god has appeared once again, and they are rubbing their hands, preparing for a second round of trading. I have obtained accurate intelligence. This time, they want to exchange for power that transcends mortals from the god. Therefore, we only have this one window of opportunity. Once missed, and after they upgrade their equipment, we will completely become fish on the chopping block, with no possibility of turning the tables. Curtis pursed his lips tightly and nodded solemnly. He reached out, his knuckles slightly white from the force, and took the heavy satellite phone. Lock onto their specific location as soon as possible, and then notify me. Curtis's tone was as cold as winter iron. Before his voice had even faded, he turned abruptly and strode away without any hesitation. Of course, the moment he turned to leave, one hand steadily picked up the white leather suitcase at his feet, the box body reflecting cold, hard light under the lamp. Inside it was the latest model that the madman Frederick had poured his heart and blood into researching, the G-virus. Frederick stood in place, his gaze like a silent ray, closely following Curtis's resolute back. Until that tall figure completely melted into the darkness in the distance, and could no longer be captured. Only then did Frederick withdraw his gaze, a strange arc that no one noticed curling at the corner of his mouth. He picked up a laptop, also turned, and left the cold building of the Wilflame Company. Those old, undying guys, aren't they still dreaming, wanting to have another trade with that god named Shooting Faye? Just wait. When I empty all the money in your bank accounts, I want to see what you will use to trade with the god. Very few people know that, besides being a biological genius, he, Frederick, is also a top-tier hacker hiding in the shadows. In this plan, Curtis is the chess piece attracting fire in the open, while he is the chess player manipulating everything from the dark. As long as Curtis successfully detonates the G-virus and creates hellish chaos at that luxurious party, he can take advantage of these muddy waters to quietly move all of those old guys' mountains of gold and silver into his own pocket. This is the real chess game he has painstakingly set up. As for the previous display of madness about dying together, that was nothing more than his carefully rehearsed acting. Really let him die. He didn't have the guts for that. It is better to live on, no matter how miserably. This old saying applies perfectly to him as well. The current situation is indeed like being forced to the edge of a 10,000-foot cliff, with an endless abyss behind him. But he simply lacks the resolution and courage to jump down. He wants to struggle desperately one more time before falling. What if he wins the gamble? Then it would be breaking free from all shackles. The sea is wide for fish to leap, the sky is high for birds to fly. St. Tobias Street. This is the crown of Haverwell City, an exclusive paradise built by the rich using piles of money. Those who live here are either rich or noble, you won't find a single poor household. As far as the eye can see, there are only vast, luxuriously designed detached villas. Without a net worth of tens of millions of US dollars, one doesn't even qualify to step foot here. What's even better is that it's only about a 10-kilometer drive from Haverwell International Airport, extremely convenient. Ever since Shooting Faye, who is hailed as a deity, descended upon Haverwell City, housing prices here shot up like a rocket, soaring rapidly. In just a few days, they have doubled or tripled, showing no signs of stopping. The reason is simple. So far, Shooting Faye has only appeared in this city. And his divine envoy, Clare, now also resides near Haverwell City's international airport. In the words of some fervent followers, living here feels a few steps closer to the deity. Perhaps one day while walking on the street, they might bathe in the deity's light of protection. For those who are truly wealthy, money is the one thing they never lack. Even though some of them have already completed their first transaction with Shooting Faye, resulting in a significant decrease in wealth. Buying a villa is still as easy for them as a common person buying a bottle of mineral water. even if this villa is priced at tens of millions of US dollars. Because not a single person present has a net worth below 10 billion US dollars. Tens of millions. To them, that's just a drop in the ocean, a trifle. In this world, the poor are as numerous as the fish crossing the river, but true tycoons are also unimaginably plentiful. You can never truly gauge the scale of the wealth empires belonging to discrete mega-rich individuals through public information. After all, keeping wealth hidden is survival wisdom passed down by the ancestors. Being too ostentatious easily attracts predators. But now, with the sudden rise of shooting Fei, hiding wealth has become an extremely foolish act. Trading those cold numbers with shooting Fei in exchange for epic-making black technology, strengthening one's own extraordinary power, or even curing terminal illnesses and regaining youth. This is far more useful than letting money sit in your hands and rot. Faced with this unprecedented opportunity, there is naturally no need to hide anything. The easternmost edge of the wealthy district. A magnificent villa covering an area of over 3,000 square meters stands quietly, like a crouching behemoth. The owner of the villa is named John Franks. He is a legend of Wall Street, a godfather-level magnate in the investment world. Born in 1922, he is now 84 years old. His entire life is an epic of dancing with economic crises. For the vast majority of people, an economic crisis is a disaster like the end of the world, but for a financial crocodile like him, it is a once-in-a-lifetime feast. By relying on repeated, precise bottom fishing and short selling, he accumulated an astronomical fortune. Outside media speculated that his assets were around 30 billion US dollars. On the list of global financial investment tycoons, he ranked 12th. But in reality, only he knew that his true net worth was over 80 billion US dollars. More than double the figure speculated by the outside world. And at this moment, an extremely extravagant banquet was underway inside his villa. Champagne bubbles rose under the crystal lamps, and the air was filled with the intoxicating scent of high-end perfume mingled with gourmet food. Nominally, this banquet was held to celebrate the return of shooting Fei. Because this meant that these top tycoons could finally trade with the deity again. Last time, they had already tasted the flavor of the miracle through the divine envoy Clare. They purchased a divine medicine that could make them return to youth and regain 100 years of vitality. A tiny pill cost each of them 10 billion US dollars. Even considering their net worth, this price was truly exorbitant. But after they personally experienced the medicinal effect, aging skin became firm again, cloudy eyes cleared up, and depleted energy erupted like a volcano. Not a single person felt the medicine wasn't worth it. At the time, their primary concern was living longer. After they experienced the young, vibrant body again, they held several days of lavish parties, and only then, still unsatisfied, did they look for shooting Fei again to trade for more powerful things. But by the time they came to their senses and prepared for another transaction, shooting Fei had disappeared. Even the divine envoy Clare could not be contacted. This led them to deep regret, pounding their chests in frustration, wondering why they hadn't been earlier or more decisive. Fortunately, now, shooting Fei was back. They had received concrete news. This time, the deity will descend personally to conduct the transaction, no longer requiring Clare as an intermediary. Shooting Fei's return was undoubtedly monumental news for this group, deserving of the grandest celebration. So at this moment, they gathered once more to commence this lavish banquet. Of course, they gathered not just for celebration and revelry. Behind the clinking glasses, they had another, more crucial goal, discussing cooperation. This group came from the pinnacle of various industries. Finance, medicine, technology, industry, energy, automotive, electronics, internet, film and television. Their presence could be found in almost every lucrative sector. They knew well that if they could integrate their respective resources and join forces, they could create a terrifying effect where 1 + 1 is far greater than 2. In fact, they had already enjoyed several successful collaborations before this. Furthermore, the shared experience of purchasing the elixir of immortality from shooting Fei had advanced their relationship and deepened their trust. Inside the villa, the atmosphere of the banquet was extraordinarily lively. Hollywood's hottest actors and actresses served as hosts, and world-class singers performed passionately on the temporary stage. Top female models with sizzling figures moved among the guests carrying trays, their fair, long legs dazzling the eye. This was a feast for the senses, a carnival of power and money. However, no one noticed that an uninvited guest had quietly arrived in a dark corner untouched by the banquet lights. Curtis stood silently in the shadows, his gaze cutting through the noisy crowd, looking at those smug, extravagant faces. In his mind, his once happy and complete family involuntarily surfaced. The sharper the contrast, the more chilling the coldness in his eyes became. Soon, his sight locked onto a target. Standing beside the host, John Franks, was a young white male in his 20s. That man was named Glenn Spant Joe. He was intimately familiar with this fool. Even if this guy had transformed from a 70-something-old geezer into a young man in his early 20s. He recognized him instantly. That face, that demeanor, had long been etched into his bones by hatred. He wished he could eat his flesh raw and drink his blood. If it weren't for him, why would his family be ruined, with his wife and children all having left him? Seeing his enemy, flushed with health, chatting and laughing while embracing a gorgeous, curvy female model. The coldness in Curtis's eyes was nearly solidifying. But he forcefully suppressed the surging rage within, his rationality had not yet been consumed. Just then, the satellite phone in his pocket emitted a slight vibration. Curtis quickly picked up the phone and held it to his ear. "This is Curtis." His voice was muffled. "Are you inside yet?" Frederick's slightly anxious voice came from the other end of the line. "I'm in." The security measures in the wealthy district where John Franks resided were like an impenetrable fortress. It wasn't a place just anyone could casually sneak into. After all, the people living here were all big shots with astonishing net worths. It would be harder for an ordinary person to sneak in than to reach the heavens. Curtis was able to infiltrate so smoothly entirely thanks to the technical support provided by Frederick. Otherwise, relying solely on himself, he probably would have been discovered by countless hidden cameras and sensors before even approaching the exterior wall of John Franks's villa. Excellent, then proceed according to plan. Start the action. Curtis did not reply, but decisively cut off the communication. On the other end of the line, Frederick also put down his phone. He quickly opened the laptop he brought, his fingers rapidly tapping on the keyboard. The screen instantly filled with dense streams of code. Inside the villa, in a smaller room with higher security clearance, John, Glenn, and other core figures were gathered here. They were enthusiastically discussing potential win-win cooperation projects and what they planned to trade for next from Shooting Faye. Just as the conversation was hitting its stride, suddenly, the entire room plunged into darkness. The magnificent crystal chandelier overhead instantly went dark, and all light sources vanished. This sudden change stunned everyone. What's going on? Why did the lights suddenly go out? John. It seems someone wants to stir up some trouble for us. John's voice was unusually calm. But don't worry, after I bought this place, I had it completely renovated. The walls, doors, and windows have all been specially reinforced and are extremely sturdy. You don't need to worry about anyone breaking in. Besides, our bodyguards are all outside. No one can do anything to us. The underground room has a backup generator. The lights will be back on soon. Crack. As if to confirm John's words, the moment he finished speaking, the room's lights flickered and returned to brightness. Humans instinctively generate a trace of panic when facing unknown darkness, and even the elites gathered here were no exception. But once the lights returned, they immediately regained their usual composure and ease. However, no one was in the mood to continue the previous topic. The power outage just now was clearly not a normal circuit malfunction. Someone immediately took out their phone and started calling the bodyguards outside to inquire about the situation. The call was answered quickly, but the result was somewhat unexpected. Nothing unusual happened. It seems the circuit breaker just tripped, causing the power outage. This answer sounded normal, but none of the people present were fools. Everyone who could earn a net worth of $10 billion was as cunning as a fox. The power outage just now was definitely not an accident. The current calm was merely a false appearance before the storm. Sure enough, the next second, a deafening loud noise suddenly came from outside. Boom! That was the dull roar produced when an explosive detonated. Even though the soundproofing in this room was excellent, everyone clearly heard the explosion. John's brow instantly furrowed. Who has such audacity? He immediately pulled out his phone and called his chief bodyguard. The call was answered almost instantly. What is the situation outside right now? What was that explosion? John demanded sharply. Well, we aren't sure what's going on yet. The voice on the other end was filled with panic. Wait, Frank, what's wrong? It's a biovirus attack. Someone released a biovirus in the villa. Boss, someone released the virus in the villa. Get out of here quickly. Ah. The call ended with John's bodyguard's mournful scream, followed by a scalp-numbing sound of tearing and chewing, and then a dial tone. This caused John's brow to knot up. He clearly realized that the situation outside had spiraled out of control and was extremely bad. He put down his phone and looked grimly at the others in the room. Someone released a biovirus at the banquet. John's voice was hoarse with anger. If you were to ask what the most terrifying terrorist attack in the world today is, then bioterrorism is absolutely the undisputed number one. The destructive power, panic effect, and economic loss caused by this stuff are incomparable to any conventional weapon. The Raccoon City incident back then was caused by a single T-virus leak, resulting in an entire prosperous city being forcibly erased from the map. The death toll and resulting economic losses remain a shocking astronomical figure to this day. Even now, just mentioning Raccoon City is enough to make people's expressions change. This is the fundamental reason why the federal government spared no expense in establishing the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance (BSAA). The purpose is to respond to potential virus leaks on federal soil and prevent the Raccoon City tragedy from recurring. As John spoke, his sharp gaze shot toward a young man with dazzling blonde hair in the crowd. This man was named Henry, a titan of the pharmaceutical industry, who owned a vast medical empire. Among them, Wilflame Company was one of his enterprises. Because of the enormous shock and commercial opportunities brought by the Raccoon City incident, he founded Wilflame Company, specializing in researching and producing various viral vaccines. The goal was that during the next virus crisis, he would hold the most reliable vaccine to protect himself, and, naturally, making a fortune along the way was implied. Not long ago, he and Frederick had a betting agreement. If Frederick could make Wilflame Company's stock price triple or more in the short term, he would give Frederick 10% of the company's shares. But later, due to the appearance of Shooting Fei, the market rhythm was disrupted, Frederick's plan failed, and his betting agreement with the other party was naturally voided. Originally, according to his style of doing things, he was prepared to simply dispose of Frederick, the failure. But the immense joy of returning to youth after obtaining the elixir of immortality had kept him excited for several days. He had been preoccupied with experiencing the wonderful feeling of being young again. He simply didn't have the time, or rather, was temporarily too lazy to deal with Frederick, whom he viewed as a small ant unable to cause any trouble. But facts proved that he had severely underestimated Frederick. And John Franks was aware of this matter. Because if Frederick's plan had succeeded, John himself would have been the fattest leek harvested in that capital feast. Therefore, the moment John heard that someone had released a virus on their turf, he immediately thought of Frederick. Because he knew that Wilflame Company was also secretly researching viruses, dabbling in both the T virus and the G virus. Even though the federal government had repeatedly issued orders strictly forbidding any institution from privately researching such dangerous biological weapons. But Wilflame Company continued to act as they pleased. Because in Haverwell City, they had protection, and that person was Councilman Davis. Although that guy was just a local councilman, he still held considerable influence in this small corner of Haverwell. Officially, he could help Wilflame Company smooth over many troubles. However, after Shooting Fei appeared, Councilman Davis was kicked aside by them without hesitation. Because that fellow was actually foolish enough to open his mouth wide like a lion, delusional about getting a share of the elixir of longevity. What an international joke. A single elixir of longevity sells for as much as 10 billion US dollars. They admitted that Davis had indeed handled many things for them. But to have them spend 10 billion US dollars to help him buy medicine. That was a pipe dream. Because Davis simply wasn't worth that price. If it were a more valuable councilman with a higher status, they might have seriously considered it. But Davis was nothing more than a puppet they pushed to the front. He had some ability, but not much. He was completely unworthy of them investing 10 billion US dollars in him. If needed, they could support someone more useful than Davis to take the position at any time, and it wouldn't cost nearly that much money. As for Davis himself, in the eyes of those tycoons, he was worth at most 100 million US dollars as a severance pay. And that was only because he was relatively obedient, otherwise, he wouldn't even get 100 million. Seeing John turn his gaze toward him, Henry instantly understood his meaning. He immediately took out his phone and called Frederick directly. The call went through, and the ringtone sounded for a long time, but there was never any answer. Henry's brow instantly furrowed tightly, and he was basically certain in his heart that this incident was the work of that fool Frederick. This caused his expression to turn extremely ugly. After all, Frederick was his employee. For him, the boss, to be so betrayed and plotted against by a subordinate employee was a sheer humiliation. It would be strange if he looked pleased. Noticing the subtle change in Henry's expression, the others present immediately understood. This matter likely had everything to do with Henry. But they didn't voice any complaints. Because they were all smart people and knew that at such a life and death moment, internal strife was the most foolish behavior. The urgent priority was how to solve the crisis before them. It hadn't been long since John bought this villa. He hadn't even had time to carry out a thorough security renovation according to his own standards. Therefore, the room they were currently in did not have a second secret escape passage. This meant that they were temporarily trapped in this small room. Of course, while Henry's face was grim, others had already quickly taken out their respective phones and begun contacting external rescue forces. None of these people were simple characters. Behind each of them lay power and means beyond the imagination of ordinary people. They didn't care what grievances Henry had with whom. They only cared about their own lives. So when it came to calling for support, every one of them was incredibly efficient. Outside the villa, it had already completely turned into a living hell. The entire banquet scene was in chaos, filled with shrill screams, desperate cries for help, and the nauseating sound of chewing. Curtis stood in the shadows in the distance, coldly watching the tragic scene at the banquet. Not only was there no trace of pity on his face, but instead, a morbid, satisfied smile appeared. At the same time, a ripple of emotion stirred in his heart. He was shocked that the madman Frederick had actually researched the G-virus to such a terrifying extent. At the moment the bomb exploded just now, he had also dispersed the latest type of G-virus he had obtained from Frederick through the blast's airwave. The mutation speed of the new G-virus was so fast it even made his heart skip a beat. From infection to mutation, the entire process took less than 5 seconds. Those infected by the virus mutated directly into monsters that defied description. They couldn't even be called zombies, because zombies at least retained a trace of a human appearance. But for these things before him, even the outline of a human appearance had completely vanished. Their bodies were covered in various eyes of different sizes that rolled about randomly, countless slimy tentacles danced wildly, and they were covered in pulsating, bright red tumors. If an ordinary person caught even a glimpse, their SAN value would plummet, and they would instantly break down. Even though Curtis had long been mentally prepared, he felt a wave of nausea at the hellish sight before him. As for regret, that word had never appeared in his dictionary. He took out his phone and dialed Frederick's number. The call was answered almost instantly. I have successfully deployed the virus. Having said that, Curtis hung up the phone immediately, not even waiting for Frederick to make any response. This was the signal he and Frederick had agreed upon from the start. Notify him immediately after deploying the virus to initiate the next step of the plan. On the other side, Frederick was sitting in a speeding business van with 3 men who had messy hair and focused expressions. The vehicle was racing toward Haverwell International Airport. Although these three men looked unremarkable and even somewhat disheveled, in reality, none of them were simple characters, all were top-tier hackers famous in the underground network world. Frederick knew this group because he himself had once been one of them. This time, he had gathered them from all over the world for only one purpose, to hack Henry's and even John's bank accounts, and transfer all their wealth, which could rival nations, into his own accounts. If this plan were attempted under normal circumstances, it would be almost impossible to succeed. After all, once such a massive amount of funds moved, the bank would certainly activate its risk control system immediately and notify Henry himself. But now, Henry and his group were trapped tightly in John's villa, and he had already arranged for people to set up high-powered signal jammers around the perimeter of the villa. When the time came, calls from inside the villa wouldn't get out, and calls from outside wouldn't get in. Henry and the others would be completely unable to receive any news in time. This created a precious time window for them, enough to transfer the money out of those ironclad bank accounts. Not just Henry, but John, Glenn, every core tycoon participating in the banquet. Frederick didn't plan to let a single one of them go. This was a staggering sum sufficient to shake global financial markets. Once a change occurred, the banks would certainly notice and might even freeze the accounts directly. But what did that matter? They were currently on their way to Haverwell International Airport. Though he hadn't traded with Shooting Fei before, he had learned through various channels that trading with Shooting Fei had a peculiar rule. As long as there was money in your account, even if it was just a number, you could directly reach a deal with the other party. The other party didn't care at all where your money came from, nor did they care if your account was frozen. As long as the numbers in your account met the price of the goods you needed, then the transaction could be established. As long as they could successfully transfer the money from John, Henry, and the rest into his own account. It wouldn't matter even if the bank realized and froze his account. Because that would still meet the conditions for trading with Shooting Fei. As long as He spent all the money before the bank could recover the funds, how would John and his group get the money back? By then, having become paupers overnight, what would they have left to retaliate against him with? Furthermore, he already had clear spending targets. Unparalleled personal power, cutting-edge technology ahead of the era, and a longer lifespan. These were the things he intended to trade for from Shooting Fei. Power was first, followed by technology, and finally lifespan. Power was the foundation to ensure he could survive what came next. Technology was the cornerstone to ensure he could continuously accumulate more wealth in the future. Even if the last item, lifespan, didn't have enough money for the trade this time, he could wait until next time. As for Curtis, that poor Avenger, he was merely a pawn sent to draw fire, a discarded piece used to stall for time. He, and the three top hackers beside him, were the most critical link in this shocking plan. After Curtis hung up the phone, Frederick also immediately dialed another number. The operation can begin, he commanded succinctly. This call was to notify the personnel he had arranged in advance to place the signal jammers around the perimeter of the villa. He could only let them act once things over at the villa had become completely chaotic. Otherwise, if the signal jammers were placed at the very beginning and the people in the villa found they couldn't make calls, it would certainly arouse immediate suspicion and disrupt his overall plan. In the car, after Frederick hung up the phone, his hands flew across the computer keyboard like butterflies through flowers. The three people beside him also immediately began to cooperate with him, like three sharp daggers, launching a fierce assault on the bank's indestructible firewall. Soon, under the combined efforts of the four, a gap was torn in that firewall, which was hailed as the most secure in the world. The bank's firewall system was extremely difficult to breach. The reason they could succeed so quickly was that they had already conducted countless simulated exercises before this. After all, Frederick had been conceiving this crazy plan for a long time. To make money, what could be faster than directly hacking into a bank's vault? But doing so was a serious crime. In the past, even if they had the ability, they would never have dared to do it. Because once the stolen amount was too large, they wouldn't be able to escape a global manhunt even if they fled to the ends of the earth. But now, it no longer mattered. As long as the plan succeeded and they obtained extraordinary power and technology ahead of the era from Shooting Fei. Even if the bank found out about it, they could only stomp their feet in anger, yet remain helpless. What was infuriating was their actions. What was helpless was that as long as the plan succeeded, the bank people couldn't do anything to them either. Moreover, the one truly suffering heavy losses wasn't the bank, the money belonged to John and those tycoons. The bank wouldn't go so far as to go head to head with a monster that had obtained extraordinary power over something like this. As for retaliation from John and the others, hey, without money, they were nothing. Frederick knew full well that so far, those old fellows had only traded with Shooting Fei for the elixir of longevity. After taking the medicine and regaining their youthful bodies, those fellows, who had been tortured by illness and aging for decades, felt as if they were reborn and were so excited they couldn't find their bearings. They spent every day hosting parties, holding banquets, playing with young women, and squandering their regained youth to their heart's content. They hadn't gone to Shooting Fei for a second trade at the first opportunity. Once he had spent all their money, what would those fellows have left to retaliate against him with? It should be said that as long as the plan succeeded, if he didn't turn back to retaliate against them, it would be considered an act of great mercy. After all, for him to reach this point, those old fellows had done plenty of pushing behind the scenes. If the plan succeeded, he would have to thank them properly, wouldn't he? On the other side, John and the others were still anxiously making phone calls, trying to contact more external forces. Suddenly, everyone's mobile signal was cut off, and the other end of the phone was left with only a Z's dial tone. None of those present were fools. They instantly realized someone had placed a signal jammer outside. With that thing around, even military-grade satellite phones couldn't hope to make a call. However, the crowd did not fall into a panic because of this. Because before this, they had already successfully made several distress calls. Rescue would arrive soon. They only needed to stay safely in this reinforced room for now, and they would be secure. But even for the brilliantly minded among them, it was completely inconceivable that at this moment, a pack of invisible hungry wolves had already set their sights on the astronomical wealth in their bank accounts. In less than 5 minutes. Rumble. Above the villa came the massive roar of helicopter rotors tearing through the air, and from the sound of it, there was more than one helicopter. Immediately following that, the da-da-da strafing of heavy machine guns and the dense bang bang of automatic rifles echoed through the night sky. Hearing these sounds, John and the others inside the villa's secret room finally breathed a long sigh of relief. Because they knew the rescue team had arrived. They were safe. The battle lasted for about 10 minutes. The villa was filled with twisted and hideous mutated monsters. This new type of G-virus, with its stronger infectivity and more potent mutation effects, created monsters that were not so easily killed. Many monsters, after being knocked down once, would undergo a second mutation and resurrect again, becoming even more powerful and berserk, which caused no small amount of trouble for the armed personnel who came to the rescue. However, the rescue personnel were well equipped, well trained, and numerous. Thus, the mutated monsters in the villa were soon mostly cleared out. Curtis watched this scene coldly from the darkness. He knew it was his turn to take the stage. He took a specially designed syringe out of that white briefcase. Inside the needle tube was a deep blue liquid, which was also the G-virus. However, compared to the diluted G-virus he had released through the explosion earlier, the one in his hand was the raw virus solution, with a concentration and effect 100 times more powerful. He was well aware that once he injected this thing into his body, he would 100% become an existence even more terrifying and powerful than those monsters outside. However, this was destined to give birth to an even more terrifying and powerful existence. After all, this thing was a masterpiece personally prepared by Frederick, using his own genetic sequence as a template to develop an ultimate virus, a custom-made G-virus belonging only to him. In Frederick's own words, this thing absolutely, definitely must not be touched until the final moment of life and death. Once used, he would no longer be Curtis Miller, but a through-and-through monster, the kind of king of monsters who could reign supreme among the horde. But when the corner of his eye caught the gunfire inside the villa gradually subsiding, and when he confirmed that Hunter and those brothers were all still breathing and unharmed, a flash of resolute madness crossed his bloodshot eyes. Without hesitation, Curtis grabbed the syringe shimmering with a deep blue luster, the veins on his arm bulging from the force, and slammed it into his bicep. The slight pain of the needle piercing his skin was almost negligible. His face remained expressionless, as if it weren't his own flesh and blood, his thumb pressed hard, pushing the virus, viscous as the blood of hell, from the syringe into his boiling veins without leaving a single drop. The next second, arg! An inhuman roar erupted from deep within his throat, and heart-wrenching pain, like billions of ants gnawing at every inch of his bones and every nerve, exploded. Curtis's body, like a cheap balloon blown to its limit, began to expand frantically at a speed visible to the naked eye. Crack! Amidst a bone-chilling tearing sound, his chest was forcibly ripped open from the center, leaving a bloody mess. Giant, writhing scarlet tentacles, dripping with viscous fluid, crawled out from that terrifying gash, flailing wildly. His two arms were not spared either, muscle fibers proliferated wildly, twisting and deforming. In just a few breaths, those arms that originally belonged to a human had actually transformed into two giant claws comparable to small cranes. On the surface of the giant claws, a grim white keratinous layer quickly condensed, shimmering with a cold, metallic luster, like a natural suit of heavy armor wrapping his arms tightly. At the very tips of the arms, two hideous white bone spikes, like bull horns, grew out, glinting coldly and incredibly sharp. His back also bulged at the same astonishing speed, quickly covered by a thick and smooth white keratinous shell, making him look like an ancient giant clad in silver-white battle armor. The terrifying wound on his chest was also covered by white keratin, forming an indestructible heart-protecting mirror. From both sides of his spine, two thick and long giant tentacles burst through his body, whipping flexibly in the air with a whoosh whoosh sound. In just the time of a few heartbeats, Curtis, a man who was an ordinary human not long ago, had completely transformed into a colossal behemoth over 20 meters tall, exuding the scent of sulfur and blood. As his earth-shaking transformation was completed, the rescue helicopter formation circling above the villa finally noticed this terrifying existence that had appeared out of thin air. Amidst the massive roar of the propellers, the pilot's eyes widened. What the hell is that? Something's wrong. Did it fall from the sky? How did such a big guy suddenly pop up? Despite the shouts of shock and uncertainty filling the cockpits, these well-trained rescue team members were no pushovers. They were piloting Black Hawk attack helicopters, fully loaded with firepower. The ammunition belts of the onboard Vulcan cannons were still hot, and the lethal Hellfire missiles on the pylons hadn't even had a chance to be fired yet. Therefore, after confirming that Curtis had completely mutated into a hostile monster, the commander gave the attack order without hesitation. Fire! Blow it to smithereens! Swoosh! 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 Several missiles, trailing scorching tail flames, tore through the night sky like a flock of bloodthirsty falcons, whistling toward Curtis's massive body. In almost the blink of an eye, the missiles hit the target accurately. Immediately following, boom, boom, rumble. A series of deafeningly violent explosions instantly swallowed Curtis's figure. The terrifying heatwaves and impact generated by the explosions, like invisible giant walls, slammed hard against everything around. Even rescue personnel hundreds of meters away could clearly feel the airwave that almost knocked them over and the scorching high temperatures. With this level of firepower coverage, let alone a person, even a main battle tank would be blown into a pile of scrap metal. That monster is probably dead, right? The billowing smoke and dust kicked up by the explosion formed a massive gray curtain, obscuring everyone's vision and making it impossible to judge what was happening inside. However, when the strong wind blew away the smoke and dust, a spine-chilling sight appeared. Curtis, that silver-white giant beast, still stood in place unscathed, without even taking a step back. The mirror-smooth layer of keratinous hard material on his body had perfectly withstood all the explosive damage from the missiles, not even a trace of scorching could be seen. This scene was transmitted in real time to the display screens of each helicopter via high-definition cameras. Every single rescue worker was dumbfounded. Their pupils quaked. Their jaws dropped. Most of these people were top-tier private security contractors. Before joining this industry, which one of them hadn't fought their way out of the world's elite military units? The Royal Marines, the U.S. Navy SEALs, Delta Force, the SAS, what bloody scenes hadn't they witnessed? Monsters. It wasn't their first time fighting them either. But a monster like this, one that could withstand missiles unscathed, they swore this was absolutely their first encounter in their lives. Meanwhile, inside the villa, after John and his group confirmed that the gunfire outside had stopped, they cautiously stepped out of the reinforced safe room. But just as they stepped out the door, they were startled by the succession of violent explosions outside. What's going on? John grabbed an armed man nearby who had come to the rescue and questioned loudly, "Why are your aircraft firing missiles directly?" "Boss." The team member's face was pale as he pointed at the massive figure in the distance, his voice trembling. "A new, big guy has appeared. The aircraft just bombed it, but it was ineffective." John and the others were momentarily stunned upon hearing this. A new giant monster. Weren't the monsters supposed to be cleared out and it was safe now? Why would a new monster suddenly appear? When they looked in the direction the team member was pointing, Curtis's colossal size, which blotted out the sky, instantly filled their vision and brought endless fear. At this moment, he had long since lost the last shred of his human rationality. His scarlet eyes held only the primal instinct bestowed by the G-virus: devour, destroy. And the futile round of missile bombardment just now had undoubtedly completely enraged this newly born vicious beast. After confirming that the attacks from those flies were ineffective against him, it was his turn to counterattack. Although his massive body looked cumbersome, his movement speed was surprisingly fast. Roar. With a roar, the two thick and long tentacles behind him, like two living giant pythons, suddenly elongated and lashed out with lightning speed at two helicopters that hadn't had time to gain altitude. Bang! Bang! Two dull thuds sounded, and those attack helicopters worth tens of millions of US dollars were like mosquitoes hit by a fly swatter, instantly losing control. Their propellers were smashed to pieces, and they crashed to the ground trailing black smoke. Boom! Boom! Two massive fireballs soared into the sky, the violent explosions echoing throughout the wealthy district, the light of the fire nearly illuminating half the night sky. At that moment, the place no longer felt like a luxurious residential area but a brutal battlefield interwoven with blood and fire. On the other side, outside Haverwell International Airport, the night had long since turned as deep as ink, but the bustle here hadn't diminished in the slightest. Shooting phase, miracle trade, was still in full swing. The rules were simple and blunt. As long as you stepped into the bounds of Haverwell International Airport and silently made a wish in your heart. As long as you could afford the price. Then, your transaction would be completed instantly. Because that omnipotent deity could discern every desire deep within your heart. When the progress bar on the laptop screen finally jumped to 100%, a nearly frenzied smile of excitement blossomed on Frederick's face. He couldn't help but be excited. Anyone who suddenly possessed huge assets worth hundreds of billions of US dollars in the blink of an eye could not possibly maintain that full gentlemanly demeanor. Yes, over 264 billion US dollars. This was the sum of the lifelong wealth of John and his group of arrogant billionaires. Although he needed to distribute a small portion of this money. But he, Frederick, would monopolize 200 billion US dollars of it. After all, this earth-shattering plan was led by him, and the role he played in it was irreplaceable. Distributing those 64+ billion was already considered unprecedentedly generous of him. Of course, this might also be related to how easily the money came. In his eyes, it was just a string of cold numbers, so he didn't feel any heartache giving it away. If 200+ billion in cash were piled in front of him right now, forming a green mountain, he probably wouldn't be willing to give a single cent to anyone else. Digital money always has a mysterious way of weakening human possessiveness over wealth. Less than a minute after the funds arrived, Frederick received a notification from the bank. His account had been unilaterally and urgently frozen. But he only scoffed at this, not caring in the least. Because his ultimate goal had already been achieved. Long before the operation, he had used technical means to place an unbreakable lock on his bank account. Even from within the bank, they wouldn't dream of transferring this money out in the short term. And this brief time difference was enough for him to complete the transaction with that deity, Shooting Faye. Inside the airport, the luxury VIP lounge that originally belonged exclusively to Clare Redfield had now become Shooting Faye's exclusive domain. Of course, the space here was huge, and Clare still lived here. It's just that Shooting Faye thoughtfully gave her 2 days off to let her accompany her brother, Chris, who had just experienced a false alarm, to relax. As for Chris's so-called mission, it had already been successfully completed as early as when Shooting Faye returned and finished that phone call. So now, this was an absolute space belonging to Shooting Faye alone. He was lying lazily on an oversized comfortable sofa, specially brought in by the airport, which could accommodate 5 or 6 people. While leisurely watching the evening news playing on the huge screen on the wall, he carelessly processed the transaction requests of thousands of people outside. With a superbrain and near-infinite telepathy, he could even communicate barrier-free with hundreds of millions of people simultaneously. This current multitasking, watching the news while trading with a mere few thousand people, was simply easier than breathing for him. Therefore, when Frederick's few, little mice, sneakily arrived within the airport range, Shooting Faye sensed them immediately. His omniscient telepathy, in an instant, read all their memories and plans completely, just like flipping through a book. Frederick's intentions were as transparent as a blank sheet of paper before him. Frederick Downing. A playful smile curled at the corners of Shooting Faye's mouth. The villain from Resident Evil. Degeneration, a guy who's somewhat clever but whose style is really not that great. In his hazy memories, this guy's ending in the movie was being caught by Leon S. Kennedy and then thrown into prison. The ending was decent, at least he kept his life. But now, because of his own appearance, the entire plot of Resident Evil had completely collapsed like a derailed train. Even Shooting Faye felt a slight surprise at the flashy operation Frederick had pulled off. This guy had actually successfully absconded with all the money from John's group and then immediately ran to him to spend it. Once the money was spent and the transaction completed, not only would John and the others lose everything and become destitute overnight, but the balance of power that allowed them to retaliate against Frederick at will would also be instantly reversed. One had to admit, this guy really knew how to play. As for whether to uphold justice for John and the others and return the money Frederick got. Heh. Shooting Faye hadn't considered that option for even a second. Business is business, who cares who you do it with? He never had the habit of being picky about trading partners. When you come to him, whether you're a saint or a villain, human or ghost, as long as you have money, you can buy everything you want. As for how your money came to be, whether through hard work or cheating and deception, Shooting Faye didn't care at all. His relationship with John's group was also just a common business relationship, they weren't even friends. Why would he have the spare time to uphold some bullshit fairness for them? This world is inherently unfair. Just as ordinary people are still worrying about their daily meals and basic necessities, that group of people possesses wealth that ordinary people couldn't spend in 100 lifetimes. Is that fair? Among 10 rich people, how many of them have a first pot of gold that is completely clean? Shooting Faye wouldn't have the slightest sympathy for top-tier predators like John and his ilk. That guy Frederick was smart. His trade list was very organized. The first goal was to obtain a power that would make it difficult for others to kill him and give him strong counterattack capabilities. The second goal was optimized technical data for the G-virus. The third goal was medicine to increase lifespan. 3 requirements in total. But Shooting Faye only intended to satisfy 2 of them. He wanted to make it hard for others to kill him and have counterattack capabilities. Simple. Shooting Faye directly exchanged a Wolverine serum for him from the System Mall. This thing was priced at $750 million in the system. Was it too much to charge him $100 billion? Not at all. He wanted the optimization technology for the G-virus. This was a bit more expensive in the system, costing $1.2 billion. Was it too much to charge him another $100 billion? Not at all. 200 billion US dollars, instantly cleared. As for the third condition, sorry, your balance is insufficient. Black-hearted. Shu Tingfei didn't think he was black-hearted. Without him, even if Frederick had those 200 billion US dollars, where would he go to buy these good things that only exist in fantasy? He snapped his fingers. Space magic was instantly activated, directly teleporting the items Frederick wanted precisely in front of him. Of course, it also came with a detailed instruction manual and a clear, product price list. At the same time, the system's cold prompt sounded in Shu Tingfei's mind. The 200 billion US dollars in Frederick's account had been instantly deducted and added to Shu Tingfei's system account balance. On the other side, I can only satisfy 2 of your trades. Because your funds are only enough to pay for the price of these 2 items. An ethereal and majestic voice boomed without warning deep within Frederick's brain. This was his first time having such intimate contact with the legendary deity, Shu Tingfei. How should he describe this feeling? Shock. Unparalleled shock. He could be 100% certain that the voice wasn't heard through his ears but rang directly in his head. Is this something an ordinary human can do? No. This has completely transcended the scope of science, it is pure metaphysics, a miracle. And, just as the rumors said, Shu Tingfei could discern every thought in the hearts of these traders. This meant that everything he had done before was seen clearly by this deity. Although he had long been mentally prepared, when he confirmed that Shu Tingfei had no intention of meddling, Frederick still let out a long sigh of relief, his heart nearly jumping out of his throat. Following closely was endless ecstasy. Because he had succeeded. The deal was struck. In the void right before him, a circle of golden light emerged out of thin air, rippling outwards like a pebble dropped in water, before forming a brilliant halo. A slender hand reached out from the halo, calmly setting down 2 items. A vial containing a bright red liquid, and a thick stack of documents smelling of fresh ink. On top of the documents sat an exquisitely printed instruction manual. The manual was clearly intended for the red serum. It detailed the serum's usage and the earth-shattering changes it would bring him after injection. As Frederick finished reading the description of the Wolverine serum, with trembling hands, his breathing grew ragged. After the injection, he would gain a near-immortal level of super-regenerative healing ability. He would gain wolf-like primal instincts and combat intuition. Furthermore, his strength, speed, and mental power would far exceed human limits. Moreover, he would gain a lifespan spanning centuries, remaining forever young and ageless. With such heaven-defying effects, let alone 100 billion US dollars, he felt it was worth it even if the price doubled. It was more than worth it. As for the technical data on the optimized G virus, in his eyes, it was equally worth its weight in gold. Because the optimized G virus possessed infinite potential and could be used to develop countless epoch-making biological drugs. Once these drugs hit the market, they would be enough to make him filthy rich, allowing him to rebuild a commercial empire even vaster than John's and the others. In short, these 200 billion were spent with exceptional value. Next, the 3 accomplices who had come with him shared the remaining 60+ billion US dollars for their transactions. This was something they had agreed upon beforehand. Over 60 billion US dollars was not a small sum for anyone. After splitting it 3 ways, they all contentedly traded for the things they had dreamed of. Meanwhile, on the other side, Curtis, who had completely devolved into a monster, had fallen into a total state of frenzy. Over half of the luxury villa complex in the wealthy district had been destroyed by him, with ruins and burning fires everywhere. Furthermore, because he had devoured quite a few humans, this fellow's size had now ballooned to a height of over 40 meters, practically like a moving mountain. Just a glance from afar was enough to make one feel a primal fear originating from biological instinct deep within the soul. Humans always feel a deep-seated fear toward massive things that far exceed their own size. The most troublesome part was that this guy was simply an unsolvable existence. Conventional weapons were no different from a scratch to him. However, John and his group still managed to escape from this living hell. After all, the private military force that came to the rescue this time had brought over a dozen helicopters. It wasn't just one person's private security force. Out of the 8 tycoons, 6 had their own private armies. This time, teams from 5 of them had arrived on the scene. With many people, there were naturally many aircraft. Even though Curtis had swatted a few out of the sky like flies, they still had enough aircraft for the evacuation. Taking away John and the other target individuals wasn't difficult. However, the evacuation process for John and the others was a pathetic sight. As they left, everyone's mood was terrible, their faces clouded with gloom. After experiencing such a near-death ordeal, it would be a miracle if their moods were good. But what they didn't know was that an even bigger, more fatal piece of bad news was waiting for them ahead. After taking the helicopters away from the wealthy district that had been turned into ruins, they soon received emergency calls from their respective bank account managers. A bolt from the blue struck all of them without warning. Their bank accounts were empty. The money inside had been transferred away, not a single cent left. This news instantly caused John and the others to collectively break down. One after another, they screamed hysterically into their phones, questioning why the banks hadn't guarded their money. And the response from the other end made them feel as if they had fallen into an ice cellar. The banks stated that after the money was transferred to an account, they had frozen that account immediately. However, even while the account was frozen, that money eventually vanished into thin air anyway. Not just the digital balances in their bank cards, but even the over 200 billion in cash, gold, and various precious gems stored in the bank vaults had also vanished without a trace. And to be able to take things out of thin air and treat bank security as if it were nothing, currently in the world, only one person could do that. That was Shu Tingfei, that high and mighty deity. The answer was already obvious. Someone had used their money to make a deal with that deity, spending their life savings until not a penny remained. All of them, overnight, had become paupers. Yes, complete and utter paupers. Perhaps they still had some other assets under their names, such as company shares, real estate in various places, limited edition sports cars in their garages, and so on. The combined value of these things might still be several billion, or even tens of billions of US dollars. To an ordinary person, this was still an astronomical figure. But the problem was, they also carried massive bank loans. Among the wealthy in this world, few don't owe money to the banks, and they were naturally no exception. Previously, they kept massive amounts of cash in the banks, so the banks were not only not in a hurry to have them repay the loans, but would instead find ways to lend them more. The more money they owed, the more interest the banks could collect. But it was different now. The cash in their bank accounts had been transferred and spent, and it was certainly never coming back. Without their money, in the eyes of the banks, they went from prime clients to high-risk bad debts. The banks would inevitably start the collection process immediately, forcing them to pay up. Even if they sold off all their remaining assets, it wouldn't be enough to fill the hole they owed the banks. Each of them owed the banks at least 20 billion US dollars in loans, and some even owed 30 or 40 billion. Banks were not charitable organizations. Once it was confirmed they had completely lost the ability to repay, the banks would absolutely show no mercy in enforcing the law and seizing everything they had left. It could be said that from the moment they received those calls, they had all become paupers with negative net worth. And to them, this was no different from a doomsday catastrophe. True, they had become younger and had abilities, perhaps they still had a chance for a comeback. But the problem was, a comeback also requires capital and conditions. Ability, on the other hand, was the least important factor. Opportunity and capital were what mattered most. An ordinary person earning 10,000 a month is considered high salaried, but a rich person with 100 million in capital can easily earn several million just by making some random investments. Even if they just stupidly left the money in the bank, 1 month's interest would be money an ordinary person couldn't earn in a lifetime. If you have 10 million, then earning your first million isn't hard for you. This is the fundamental reason why the rich get richer while the poor stay poor, and why class solidification is hard to break. Now, not only were they penniless, they also owed the banks an astronomical amount of debt. Even if they sold all their remaining assets, they couldn't pay back the bank's money. In a sense, they were more miserable than truly poor people. At least poor people wouldn't owe the bank so much money, because the bank would never lend that much to a poor person. It could be said that Frederick's move hadn't just emptied their wallets, it had kicked them directly into an abyss from which there was no return. Even if they were young now and could live another 100 years, so what? Burdened by massive debt, the fine wine, beautiful women, luxury cars, and villas, that life of debauchery they once knew would be completely cut off from them. In such a situation, what was the point of living another 100 years? It is easy to go from frugality to luxury, but hard to go from luxury to frugality. Accustomed to a lavish life of spending money like water and having servants at their beck and call, they couldn't last a single day living like ordinary people. Those with weaker willpower would probably choose suicide directly. Aren't there plenty of rich people who lost everything in the stock market and leapt from rooftops? And their current situation was even worse than those people's. At least those people just lost their money. Even if they had debts, it was at most a few million or tens of millions. Because they simply couldn't borrow any more money than that. But what about them? Not only did they have no money, but even after mortgaging all their remaining assets, they would still owe the banks billions or even tens of billions of US dollars. With such a massive figure, even if they lived another 100 years, they might not be able to pay it off. After all, the primitive accumulation of capital is the hardest step. Opportunity and funds, both are indispensable. Funds, they now had none. And opportunity, that was an ethereal thing that can be sought but not easily found. For a moment, the entire helicopter cabin fell into a deathly silence. Everyone put down their phones and remained silent, the light in their eyes quickly dimming like a candle about to go out. The feeling of falling from heaven to hell was probably exactly like this. Do you think, if we go to that deity, finally, someone broke the silence with a raspy voice, he will return our money to us? These words didn't stir even a ripple in the hearts of the others. Because they all knew in their hearts that it was simply impossible. If Shooting Fei really cared about this, he wouldn't have made a deal with the guy who ran off with their money in the first place. It was obvious that in Shooting Fei's eyes, this group of so-called elites was absolutely nothing. If they went to find Shooting Fei now, how could he possibly return the money to them? It was no different from daydreaming. It's impossible, another person sneered. Besides, do you really dare to go and confront that God face to face? Most ordinary citizens didn't have much fear of Shooting Fei. After all, he was too close to them. So close that it felt like Shooting Fei had become a part of their daily lives. Without that sense of unreachable distance, there was naturally no fear to speak of. But that was the thinking of ordinary people. Because they would subconsciously ignore some terrifying things that would become clear upon deeper reflection. But John and the others were different. They were smart people, they wouldn't deliberately ignore those crucial details. Don't be fooled by how any random person can trade with Shooting Fei now. First, you must understand one thing. Shooting Fei is not a human, he is a god. Can a god's logic be the same as a human's logic? Even though Shooting Fei is trading happily with them now, if one day this deity suddenly changes his mind, can these fragile mortals withstand his divine power? Also, why does Shooting Fei want so much money? Why would an omnipotent god need the currency of human society? To a great existence like him, money should be completely meaningless. No one had ever deeply considered these questions. Or rather, most people subconsciously ignored the terrifying truth behind this matter. Then what should we do next? Someone else asked in despair. Pushed to the edge of the cliff, there seemed to be no choice but to leap. Even though they were once business elites who strategized and planned, they were now at their wits' end. Of course, while John and the others were worrying about their futures, another person was also in a frantic state. This person was the mayor of Haverwell City, Mayor Elwin Caesar. John and that group of tycoons had escaped via helicopters. But the problem was, that giant monster named Curtis hadn't been dealt with. This guy was now a walking natural disaster, a massive source of trouble. Without the fire support of the rescue teams to keep him in check, after completely leveling the wealthy district, he roared and charged directly toward the densely populated downtown area. Add to that the fact that he was essentially a massive collection of biochemical viruses. If left unchecked, Haverwell City would be the next Raccoon City. Mayor Elwyn hadn't been idle, but the SWAT team he sent out had been wiped out minutes ago. In this situation, who else could he send? He was only a mayor, not the President of the United States. He didn't have command over the military. Of course, he had also thought about seeking help from Shooting Faye. But whether that high and mighty deity would care about such mortal affairs, he really wasn't sure. However, his secretary soon gave him a brilliant idea. Going directly to Shooting Faye might not work, but going to Clare Redfield, that divine envoy, should have the same effect. After all, Miss Clare was someone whom Shooting Faye had personally acknowledged and bestowed with great power. Mayor Elwyn used all his connections and spent a full 10 minutes to finally get the phone number of Clare's brother, Chris Redfield. It couldn't be helped. Clare's own phone number was now a top-level secret and very hard to obtain. On the other hand, her brother Chris's number wasn't that hard to find. At this time, in a large amusement park in Haverwell City, Chris, Clare, Clare's friend, and her young niece Sherry were having the time of their lives. Because of Clare's special status, the amusement park not only made everything completely free for their group, but also gave them VIP treatment with no wait times for any attractions, and all the food and drinks in the park were theirs for the taking. However, the siblings, Chris and Clare, both declined this kindness. After all, they weren't short on money now. Chris had just easily earned tens of millions of US dollars in consulting fees, with just a dozen phone calls. As for Clare, as Shooting Faye's divine envoy, Shooting Faye naturally hadn't mistreated her. In terms of money, he had casually given her tens of millions in pocket money. He had also given her many other good things. For example, those longevity pills worth 10 billion each, Shooting Faye had given Clare 3. Although the external selling price was extremely high, in the System Mall, the cost price wasn't actually that expensive. One could be bought for 10 million US dollars. Besides that, there were some other wondrous items. Neither of them lacked money, so they naturally wouldn't take advantage of the amusement park's small favors. After all, the most expensive things in this world are often free. After playing like crazy in the amusement park for the entire afternoon, the siblings felt a long-lost happiness. Since their parents passed away, they hadn't played together in an amusement park so carefree for a very, very long time. When their parents were still alive, the two siblings were regulars at the amusement park. A few people who were a bit tired from playing stopped in front of a colorful ice cream stall. Clare was happily buying ice cream for Sherry and themselves. Just then, the phone in Chris's pocket suddenly vibrated. Chris was stunned for a moment. Very few people ever called his private number on a regular day. The number of people who knew this number could be counted on one hand. Besides his comrades in arms who had faced life and death with him, there were only those wealthy men who had, generously, sent him money before. He pulled out his phone and swiped to answer. Hello, this is Chris. Hello, Mr. Chris, I am very sorry to disturb you. This is Elwyn Caesar, the mayor of Haverwell City. The voice on the other end sounded very urgent. Mayor Elwyn. Chris raised an eyebrow, feeling somewhat surprised. Why are you calling me? Is there something I can help with? He didn't even know the mayor of Haverwell. Why was this guy calling him? Could he be trying to find his sister, Clare, through him? But the problem was, Shooting Faye himself was back now. If there was a deal to be made, one could just go directly to Shooting Faye. There was no need to go through Clare as an intermediary anymore. I am very sorry to disturb you at a time like this, Mr. Chris. Elwyn's voice came through the receiver with a hint of pleading, but I am calling you because I want to ask Divine Emissary Clare for help. What happened? Who's calling you? Just then, Clare had finished buying the ice cream and came skipping back. She held a strawberry-flavored one in one hand and a chocolate-flavored one in the other. She handed one to Sherry and was about to hand the other to Chris. As soon as she finished buying the ice cream and turned around, she saw Chris frowning, talking to someone on the phone. It's the mayor of Haverwell, Elwyn. Chris took the ice cream from Clare and handed her the phone. He's looking for you, talk to him yourself. With a face full of confusion, Claire put the cool phone to her ear. It's Clare. Mayor Elwyn, right. Why are you looking for me so urgently? The voice on the other end sounded exhausted, even carrying a hint of despair. My Lord Divine Emissary, Miss Clare, I am terribly sorry to disturb you at a time like this, but I truly have no other choice. Claire's beautiful eyebrows furrowed slightly. She didn't reply immediately but listened quietly, her fingertips unconsciously tapping on the smooth phone case. She could sense an ominous, bloody storm brewing from Mayor Elwyn's trembling tone. The situation is like this, the mayor's voice was almost breaking. Someone released a never-before-seen virus in the center of Haverwell City. Preliminary identification suggests it's the latest variant of the G virus. We don't know what the person who released it did, but the monster spawned by this virus is unprecedented in strength. We even used missiles for a direct bombardment, and the result was that we couldn't even damage a single scale on it. The elite SWAT team I urgently dispatched has lost all contact. I fear they have met with disaster. I am completely at my wit's end, so I have taken the liberty of asking for your help as a divine emissary. I implore you, save Haverwell City from its peril and completely destroy the terrifying creation. Claire was stunned for a moment, completely unexpected that the other party's call would be a request comparable to the beginning of a disaster movie. The air seemed to freeze for a few seconds. Finally, she took a deep breath and made a decision in her heart. That monster had to be dealt with by her. Where exactly is that thing now? Send me the precise coordinates, and I'll head over immediately. At her core, Claire was always a girl whose heart was soft to the point of kindness. If she had been unaware of such a thing, it would be one thing, but once she knew, and she possessed the ability to turn the tide, there was no way she could stand by and watch a city turn into a hellscape. The power of the talismans personally bestowed by Shooting Fae was flowing quietly within her body, a power sufficient to shake the world. She was no longer the ordinary girl who needed her brother's protection. It was no exaggeration to say that even if she were dropped directly into that movie world called Marvel, with the extraordinary abilities she currently possessed, she would absolutely be a top-tier existence at the peak of the pyramid among those various superheroes. The rabbit talisman granted her divine speed exceeding the sound barrier. The dog talisman gave her an immortal and indestructible divine body. The horse talisman brought the miracle of instantly healing all pain and injuries. The rooster talisman gave her the psychokinetic power to control objects with her mind. The dragon talisman allowed her to breathe out dragon flame blasts that could incinerate everything. Once these incredible abilities were perfectly stacked on her, just imagining that scene was enough to make one's scalp tingle. Even Thor, who wielded a hammer and called himself the god of thunder, or the Hulk, who could smash everything when angry, she was absolutely certain she could defeat them in a direct confrontation. One must know that any single one of these talismans was enough to create a powerful superhero out of thin air. Not to mention, the power of 5 whole talismans concentrated in one person. In that so-called Marvel Cinematic Universe, if T0 represents the creation god level that roams the universe, T1 is the Skyfather level that rules the stars, and T2 is the slightly inferior sub-Skyfather level, then if Shendu, with all 12 talismans, were to descend, he would undoubtedly be a T0 level existence, and a top-tier cosmic overlord with explosive combat power who could walk over anyone. And Claire, who now possessed the power of 5 talismans, even if she couldn't reach the T1 Skyfather level, was at least a solid T2 sub-Skyfather level powerhouse. How could she possibly be weak? Although Claire had never actually engaged in a real battle after receiving this divine grace from Shooting Fae, she knew better than anyone just how vast and majestic the power within her body was. It was definitely thousands or tens of thousands of times more powerful than the strength she used to casually incinerate a passenger plane before. The most crucial point was that her talisman power came from Shooting Fae's sharing, not something she had figured out herself. This meant she could perfectly wield this divine power at 100%, with zero loss. She wasn't like Jade and the others from the world of Jackie Chan adventures, who held the talismans but couldn't unleash their true, world-destroying power. Clare could fully release the entire potential of the talismans. Therefore, she had an absolutely clear understanding of her current strength. This was also the fundamental reason why she agreed to Mayor Elwyn's difficult request almost without hesitation. It wasn't just because of the kindness in her heart, but also because of her absolute strength that could crush everything. On the other end of the phone, Mayor Elwyn was so overjoyed at the moment he received the affirmative answer that he almost threw his phone away. With Divine Emissary Clare personally taking action, there was finally a glimmer of hope against that monster mutated from Curtis. He immediately reported the monster's real-time location to Clare as quickly as possible. "I'll be there soon." Having said that, Clare didn't hang up the phone but turned her head to look at her worried brother, Chris, and quickly explained. "A very troublesome mutated creature has appeared in Haverwell City. I must go and deal with it. Can you handle it alone?" Chris's brow instantly twisted into a knot, his concern evident in his voice. Of course he was worried about his sister's safety. Even though he had witnessed Clare becoming a divine emissary and gaining the divine power bestowed by Shooting Fae, that concern born of blood ties still made his heart feel heavy. "Don't worry, brother," Clare winked playfully, her smile full of confidence. "I'm super powerful now. Besides, there's a wonderful connection between that god and me. If I really can't handle that monster, he will definitely step in immediately." Clare knew in her heart that Shooting Fae might not be a god who liked to meddle in other people's business, but he definitely possessed a compassionate heart. Especially toward her, his personally chosen divine emissary, he was exceptionally good. Otherwise, how could Shooting Fae have generously bestowed so many priceless things upon her? Then, alright then. Chris knew that he couldn't help with this matter at all, so he could only take a deep breath and solemnly urge, "You must be extremely careful." He didn't try to persuade his sister to give up. Instead, he chose trust and support. Clare nodded vigorously, a determined light flashing in her eyes. "It's an emergency. I'll head over and take care of that big guy first. When it's done, I'll come back and find you." As soon as she finished speaking, Clare had already identified the direction. In the next second, her figure was like a cannonball fired from a barrel, suddenly soaring into the sky. Boom! A deafening sonic boom cloud exploded on the spot, while she herself trailed a white vapor trail straight into the sky. In less than a breath's time, she had already turned into a rapidly receding black dot, completely disappearing at the end of the horizon. The extreme divine speed of the rabbit talisman, combined with the flight telekinesis of the rooster talisman, allowed Clare's flight speed to reach a jaw-dropping level. Easily breaking Mach 10 was just a warm-up for her. Even better, because she was protected by the immortality of the dog talisman and the healing power of the horse talisman, that terrifying wind strong enough to tear steel apart felt like a gentle spring breeze as it blew against her, having no effect at all. Even without those two talismans, she could use the rooster talisman's telekinesis to build an invisible force field shield around her body to resist all physical impacts brought by high-speed flight. On the other end of the phone, Mayor Elwyn only heard bursts of whooshing, terrifying wind howls that seemed to want to tear his eardrums apart. Besides that, he couldn't hear any other sound. He was stunned at first, and then an incredible thought surged into his mind. Could this be the sound of the wind blast produced by divine emissary Clare flying at high speed? Sure enough, not long after, he suddenly looked up and saw a figure rushing toward him at the speed of a meteor on the gloomy skyline. Although that figure was still just a small dot, it could be vaguely identified as a human shape. And that giant beast transformed from Curtis was wreaking havoc less than 1,000 meters away from him at this moment. It was no wonder that he, the mayor, had to be on the front lines to oversee the battle. The destruction and casualties caused by Curtis this time were truly too heavy. If he didn't dare to appear on the scene, then what awaited him would be stepping down at best, or he might even be sent to court by the angry public and thrown into prison. There was no other way. After all, he held the title of mayor of Haverwell City. So he had to stand here, at least to let everyone see his attitude. This way, even if responsibility was pursued in the end, the most he would face was resigning and bearing the reputation of being incompetent. It was better than being sent to a cold prison. In the sky, Claire's gaze had already locked onto the huge figure wreaking havoc in the city. After all, its current size was truly too eye-catching. The 40-meter-tall Curtis was practically a moving small hill. Claire could see such a massive target clearly even when she was still 10 kilometers away in the sky. The several thick and long tentacles behind it just swung casually, and a building over 10 stories high collapsed like building blocks, shattering into a pile of rubble. The blocks around it had long been destroyed beyond recognition, as if having experienced a localized earthquake. On the outermost cordon, many police officers were risking their lives in a fierce exchange of fire with the small monsters produced after being infected by it. Their mission was to prevent the virus from spreading further to the outskirts of the city. I have arrived. Have all your police retreat. Everything from here on out will be handled by me. Claire's figure suddenly hovered in the air as she picked up her phone and said to Mayor Elwyn on the other end. Elwyn had been clutching his phone, his nerves stretched like a string about to snap, waiting for the divine emissary's instructions at any moment. Hearing Claire's words now, he didn't hesitate for a second. He immediately turned around and gave the order to the secretary beside him. He told him to notify the chief of the city police department as quickly as possible and order all frontline officers to retreat immediately. The order was quickly transmitted to every combat unit via radio waves. Although the police officers who were fighting a bloody battle were full of confusion, not understanding why their superiors would suddenly give such an order that made them feel like they were deserting. They still executed it without hesitation. Because those monsters were truly too difficult to deal with. There were already a large number of casualties in their ranks, and the air was filled with the strong smell of blood and gunpowder. Everyone knew that after this incident, the compensation the city government would need to pay would likely be an astronomical figure. After all, before them, 3 full SWAT teams had already rushed in, and the result, they had all vanished into thin air, with not even a single complete body found. When the last police officer had retreated from the first line of battle, Claire finally took action. The speed of the rabbit talisman could theoretically be stacked infinitely. In that ancient legendary world, the extreme speed of the rabbit talisman could even tear through the barriers of time, allowing one to achieve time travel, returning to the distant past or traveling to an unknown future. Jade once relied on the power of the rabbit talisman to return to the time when she was just a child, and the Jade from the future had also used it to return to her childhood timeline. In a sense, there was no upper limit to the speed of the rabbit talisman. When the speed reached a certain critical point, even the legendary mutant Quicksilver, who was known for his speed, would appear like a snail crawling in front of such high-speed movement. Of course, the premise for all of this was that you must be able to perfectly control the violent power of the rabbit talisman. Otherwise, if you ran too fast and happened to hit something, with a fragile human body, you would be the unlucky one. But Claire's power was shared, from shooting Faye, a perfect fit with no rejection. She could wield the rabbit talisman as naturally as breathing. Therefore, she didn't need to worry about any risk of losing control at all. After all, the police had retreated to a safe area. Claire's figure dropped vertically from the high altitude, and the moment she landed, she shot out like a swift and incomparable leopard, skimming the ground. Her speed got faster and faster, faster and faster. At the same time, a mass of scorching flames that seemed to come from the depths of hell began to envelop her entire body. Dragon Talisman, activated. Wherever that terrifyingly high-temperature dragon flame passed, even solid steel would be instantly vaporized into a wisp of blue smoke. That's the end of Part 3. Part 4 is coming soon.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and support our channel for more stories.